Before satellites drew invisible lines across the sky, before digital maps pulsed beneath our fingertips, humanity faced a horizon it could not name. The sea, vast, unknowable, endless, was once the edge of everything we understood. To cross it was to challenge the divine. To sail too far was to risk falling into the abyss. For centuries, people stood on the shores of Europe, Asia, and Africa, watching the waves crash like the heartbeat of something ancient and alive. The ocean was a mystery written in motion, its winds unpredictable, its stars unreadable, its depths unforgiving. Yet from that fear came faith. Faith in a needle that always pointed north. Faith in ink lines drawn upon parchment. Faith that beyond the horizon there was more. More land, more life, more meaning. The age of navigation did not begin with kings or empires. It began in the hands of craftsmen, men who forged magnetic needles in smoky workshops, who copied coastlines by candlelight, who tested wood in sail against storms. It began with those who looked at chaos and sought order, who turned curiosity into compass and wonder into science. Every voyage was a question, what lies beyond? Every map, a prayer made of ink. Every compass, a promise to return. Before satellites drew invisible lines across the sky, before digital maps pulsed beneath our fingertips, humanity faced a horizon it could not name. The sea, vast, unknowable, endless, was once the edge of everything we understood. To cross it was to challenge the divine. To sail too far was to risk falling into the abyss. From the windswept ports of Lisbon to the markets of Venice, from Arab scholars charting stars to Chinese sailors steering by magnetized stone, the tools of discovery spread like whispers carried by the tide. And with them came a new idea, that the world could be measured, understood, conquered. This is the story of courage and calculation, of wood, iron, and imagination, of how a simple compass and a fragile map guided humanity into the modern age, and how the dream to cross the sea became the dream to touch the stars. This is Oceans of Discovery. Before you sail with us across history, like, share, and subscribe. And let's set our course together beyond the horizon. Before men charted the stars or drew the shapes of continents, they watched the sea like they watched the face of a god, unpredictable, beautiful, and cruel. The sea was motion without mercy. It had no borders, no boundaries, only the endless breathing of tides. In every ripple, the ancient world saw a warning. The early mariners of Europe and the Mediterranean hugged the coasts like children clinging to a parent's arm. Their vessels were small, fragile shells of wood and pitch. They could smell the earth even when they could no longer see it. For them, land was safety, a promise that the world still existed. Out there, beyond the horizon, was madness. Myths filled the waters long before maps did. To the Greeks, the ocean was Okeanos, a serpent encircling the world. To the Norse, it was Jormungandr, a monster so vast that it bit its own tail beneath the waves. To the sailors of the Middle Ages, the sea was a cemetery of ships and souls. They believed in waters that boiled, in islands that sank overnight, in creatures with eyes like lanterns and mouths large enough to swallow a man whole. But beneath the fear, something else stirred curiosity, a whisper that maybe the world was larger than anyone dared to believe. In fishing villages of the North Sea, men who had never read a book began reading the sky. They learned the pattern of the clouds, the tilt of the gulls, the smell of salt before a storm. Navigation began not as a science, but as a conversation between man and sea, between instinct and survival. The Phoenicians, centuries earlier, had already mastered this language. They sailed by the stars, trading across the Mediterranean when the rest of the world was still afraid of losing sight of shore. Their ships carved routes of commerce and culture, from Tyre to Carthage, from Egypt to Spain. They were among the first to trust the horizon. They believed that what was unseen was not necessarily forbidden. Far to the north, another people learned the same truth through hardship, the Vikings. Their longships cut through freezing fog and roaring storms. They relied not on compasses, but on memory, the flight of birds, the color of water, the taste of air. Some historians believe they reached North America centuries before Columbus. But to them, it was not discovery, it was survival. They crossed oceans not for glory, but because the sea was in their blood. For most of medieval Europe, however, the ocean remained a paradox, both lifeline and threat. Ports like Venice and Genoa thrived on trade but feared what lay beyond familiar routes. The Mediterranean was a sea of certainty, hemmed in by land, rich with commerce and civilization. Beyond Gibraltar, the Atlantic was different. Sailors called it Mare Tenebrosum, the Sea of Darkness. They said its winds howled with the voices of lost souls. They said its edge dropped into the void. And yet, standing on the cliffs of Portugal, watching the sun vanish into an ocean of fire, there were always a few who wondered, what if the sun was not dying, but traveling? What if the horizon was not the end, but the beginning of another world? It is said that progress begins when fear becomes unbearable. The fear of not knowing, of staying behind, became stronger than the fear of the waves. The transformation began quietly. In monasteries, scholars copied ancient texts by candlelight: Aristotle, Ptolemy, Arab astronomers who had charted stars with precision unknown in the West. Knowledge that had traveled from Baghdad and Alexandria filtered slowly into the minds of European thinkers. If the stars were predictable, then perhaps the sea was not chaos, but a pattern waiting to be read. By the 13th century, whispers spread among sailors of a new tool, something from the east, a device that could point north, even in darkness. Some called it magic, others heresy. But those who dared to test it saw its truth. A magnetized needle suspended on water, always turning toward a single direction. The compass. It was the beginning of certainty, of fragile, trembling certainty, but enough to challenge centuries of superstition. Still, before compasses became widespread, men learned by losing. Ships vanished without trace. Entire crews perished within sight of the coast. Every voyage was a gamble with nature, with wind, with hunger, with the silence of the sea. When storms came, there was no warning. The horizon turned black, the waves rose like mountains, and the world shrank to the width of a deck. Sailors prayed, cursed, and sang to keep from going mad. But every survivor brought back something invaluable: knowledge. A pattern of winds, a hidden current, a landmark that others could use. Slowly, bit by bit, they mapped the unknown not with ink, but with memory. It was this slow accumulation of courage, this gathering of mistakes and miracles, that prepared humanity for the great leap forward. The sea remained merciless, but it was no longer mute. It began to whisper directions if one listened carefully enough. In the taverns of Lisbon, old sailors told tales of islands glimpsed at the edge of vision. They spoke of floating lands, of forests beyond fog, of strange birds that followed their ships for days. The more they told the stories, the less impossible they seemed. Rumor became map. Map became mission. Across Europe, the sea called to dreamers and madmen alike, merchants seeking new spice routes, scholars chasing lost knowledge, monarchs hungering for empire. Each looked upon the same ocean, but saw something different. To some, it was a path to wealth. To others, a doorway to God's creation. To a few, it was destiny. The first explorers were not conquerors, but listeners, men who learned to interpret the moods of the ocean. They knew that the wind was a language, that clouds spoke of storms, that silence foretold disaster. In time, their intuition evolved into skill, and skill into science. They began to understand that the sea was not infinite. It only seemed that way to those without instruments. But technology was only half the battle. The real struggle was faith, the belief that human hands could master something so immense. Faith in wood that would not splinter. Faith in ropes that would not snap. Faith in stars that would not lie. This faith was the birth of navigation itself, not blind belief, but a disciplined defiance of fear. By the late Middle Ages, Europe was ready to step beyond the edge of myth. Ports grew into laboratories. Sailmakers, shipwrights, and scholars worked side by side. The ocean that had once symbolized death now promised rebirth, economic, scientific, even spiritual. For the first time, humanity began to see itself not as prisoner of the world, but as its explorer. The sea that had once divided continents was about to unite them. As the chapter closes, we return to a small, flickering light, the glow of a lamp on a sailor's table. A rough hand traces a route across parchment. Outside, the wind howls like an omen, but inside, the man smiles. The storm no longer terrifies him. He knows which way is north, because somewhere in the dark, a needle has begun to turn. The dawn of the 14th century rose not with conquest, but with curiosity. In harbors from the Baltic to the Mediterranean, humanity's gaze turned outward. Ships that had once crept along the coastline now dared to wander further, chasing rumors of distant lands. The ocean, once feared as an endless abyss, began to feel navigable. It started with trade. Spices, silks, and gold, the materials of dreams, traveled by caravan across deserts and mountain passes. But merchants hungered for faster ways. The sea promised shortcuts to fortune, if only it could be trusted. Venice, Genoa, and later Lisbon became gateways not just for goods, but for knowledge. Every crate unloaded from a ship carried whispers of geography, winds, and tides. Every sailor's story was a fragment of the world's unfinished map. And in those fragments, something extraordinary began to form a pattern. The seas, it turned out, had rhythms. Winds returned in seasons, currents followed invisible paths, and the stars wheeled overhead in perfect precision. The ocean, when studied with patience, revealed itself not as chaos, but as a living system, vast, but understandable. In candlelit workshops along the Adriatic and Iberian coasts, the first portolan charts emerged. They were unlike any maps before them. Not the theological circles of the Middle Ages, where Jerusalem sat at the center of creation, but instruments of utility, drawn from direct observation. Lines crisscrossed the parchment, radiating from compass roses like threads of fate. Each line pointed to a direction known by wind and experience. For the first time, the sea could be read. The men who drew these maps were artisans and scientists, though they never called themselves that. They listened to returning sailors, marking every detail: a stretch of rocky coast, a hidden shoal, a current that dragged ships westward. Knowledge, once scattered in superstition, was stitched together by ink. The map became a mirror, not of God's order, but of human effort. Yet even as maps spread across Europe, the ocean's mystery deepened. The more men knew, the more they realized how little they understood. Tales from the edge of the Atlantic of islands that vanished in fog, of magnetic stones that pulled nails from ships, of monstrous whales that swallowed fleets refused to die. Superstition and science sailed side by side, uneasy companions on the same deck. In the north, the Hanseatic League bound together merchants from the cold waters of Scandinavia to the ports of Germany. Their ships, bulky cogs with high sides and square sails, braved icy tempests to trade fur, timber, and salt. In the south, Arab navigators crossed the Indian Ocean with precision that baffled Europeans, guided by stars and seasonal monsoons. To the west, Irish monks spoke of islands seen in visions, green lands adrift beyond the sunset. Each culture, in its own way, listened to the same sea and heard different music. The Renaissance would one day celebrate the human mind, but long before that, sailors celebrated something humbler: endurance. Out there, beyond the safety of stone walls and churches, survival depended not on scripture, but on skill. A man could pray to Saint Nicholas, patron of sailors, but he also learned to read the wind by the flutter of his sailcloth, to sense a storm by the taste of the air. The sea demanded faith, but it rewarded intelligence. As knowledge spread, so did ambition. Monarchs, merchants, and mystics all turned to the horizon. The Portuguese, perched on the western edge of Europe, were the first to see the Atlantic not as an obstacle, but as a doorway. Their fishermen had long ventured into deeper waters in search of cod and mackerel. Now their princes saw something more: a route to glory. In the shipyards of Lisbon, carpenters and craftsmen worked under the salt air, hammering together vessels that could withstand the long swells of the open ocean. The caravel was born light, swift, and agile, with triangular lateen sails that could harness the wind from any direction. For the first time, humans possessed a ship not merely for coasting, but for exploration. But technology alone was not enough. The mind had to follow where the hull dared to go. That meant unlearning centuries of fear, the fear of the edge of the world. For medieval Europe, the world was a closed box. Heaven above, hell below, and between them, a flat earth bounded by divine order. The thought of sailing west into nothingness bordered on blasphemy. And yet, quietly, belief began to shift. Ancient texts resurfaced translations of Greek and Arab astronomers, suggesting a spherical Earth, a continuous ocean. The Church did not officially teach a flat world, but popular imagination clung to it. Sailors, however, had no patience for doctrine. The sea was not flat or round to them, it simply was, and it demanded respect. Night after night, on lonely decks, they looked upward. The sky became their cathedral, the stars their scripture. Polaris, the North Star, shone like a promise, fixed and faithful amid the shifting heavens. The mariner's faith turned scientific, his prayers mathematical. Each voyage, each returning ship, added another verse to humanity's great, unfinished psalm of discovery. Still, the ocean never gave its lessons freely. Many who sought its secrets paid with their lives. Ships were swallowed by storms, crews lost to starvation or scurvy, names erased by the waves. But their deaths were not in vain. Every disaster became data. Every tragedy, instruction. The survivors told their stories, and those stories became warnings. The sea was the greatest teacher humanity ever had and the harshest. By the 15th century, Europe stood on the threshold of transformation. Ports hummed with rumor and expectation. New tools appeared, better charts, sturdier hulls, instruments that could measure the height of the Sunday. The compass, once an exotic curiosity from China, had become indispensable. Suspended in glass or mounted on wood, its trembling needle pointed the way even when the stars hid behind clouds. In that moment, human history tilted. The sea, once the limit of imagination, became the stage for it. For the first time, mankind began to think globally, not in myth, but in measurement. The ocean had tested humanity for millennia. Now, humanity was ready to answer. A transformation had occurred quietly in the heart of every sailor. The horizon was no longer a line of fear, but a promise of continuity. If the world was round, then every direction led home eventually. The sea that once symbolized chaos had become the thread connecting all lands, all fates. At the edge of Europe, on a cliff above the restless Atlantic, a figure stands in the wind. A mariner. His hands are calloused, his eyes sharp with longing. In his pocket, a small needle rests in a wooden box, his compass. Below him, waves crash like thunder. He feels both the weight of fear and the pull of destiny. Somewhere beyond that endless gray lies a path, invisible but real. He knows others have tried and failed. He knows the sea devours the unprepared. But he also knows something deeper, that human courage grows only when faced with the impossible. Behind him, the land holds comfort. Ahead of him, infinity. He steps forward. And in that single step, that act of defiance against centuries of fear, the age of navigation begins. For centuries, sailors had looked to the heavens to find their way. Stars, the moon, and the sun were their silent companions. But clouds hid them, storms scattered them, and fog devoured all reference to the world. In the endless gray of the sea, when heaven was veiled and land had long vanished, there was only directionless fear. Then came a needle. It did not roar like thunder, nor shine like fire. It whispered, suspended over a pivot, a sliver of metal turned not toward the wind, not toward the sun, but toward something unseen. North. Always north. To those who first saw it move, it was magic. To those who learned to trust it, it was salvation. The story of the compass begins far from the Atlantic, in the heart of ancient China. More than 1,000 years before Europe's age of sail, Chinese scholars had already studied a peculiar stone lodestone that pulled bits of iron toward it. They called it the loving magnet. It was both mystery and miracle, proof that the earth itself possessed a hidden spirit. By the Han Dynasty, they were shaping this stone into spoons that pivoted freely on bronze plates. When left undisturbed, the spoon's handle pointed south, not because it desired to, but because the earth commanded it to. The Chinese called this alignment geomancy, the harmony between heaven, earth, and man. At first, the compass guided not sailors, but priests and architects. Temples were built according to its orientation. Cities aligned with cosmic order. The world was no longer a guessing game of directions. It had a measurable pulse. But somewhere between the 4th and 11th centuries, A transformation occurred quiet, profound, irreversible. The compass left the shrines and entered the ships. Chinese mariners on the South China Sea learned to hang magnetic needles from silk threads, floating them in bowls of water to stabilize their motion. When storms blotted out the stars, they turned to the floating needle. It never lied. With this small, trembling instrument, they could sail the fog-choked coasts of Asia, across trade routes that connected the East to India, Arabia, and eventually Africa. From that moment, the ocean shrank. Trade spread. So did knowledge. Along with silk, porcelain, and paper, travelers carried another invisible export: the idea that the earth itself could guide a man. Somewhere along the Silk Road, that secret crossed deserts and mountains, passing through the Islamic world, scholars in Baghdad, astronomers in Damascus, mathematicians in Cairo. The Muslim navigators were masters of the stars, yet when they encountered the magnetic needle, they recognized its power instantly. They refined it, recorded its behavior, and used it to determine the Qibla, the direction of Mecca, even in distant lands. By the 13th century, the knowledge reached the Mediterranean. Genoese, Venetian, and Catalan sailors adopted it eagerly. No one knows the exact moment the first European held a compass, but its impact was immediate. It was as if an ancient blindness had been cured. Imagine the scene. A storm rages off the coast of Portugal. A merchant ship battles waves as high as towers. The sky is black. The helmsman cannot see the stars, cannot tell east from west. Then, in the flickering light of a lantern, he holds a small wooden box. Inside, a needle floats on a card marked with symbols NSEW. The needle quivers, then steadies, pointing to the same direction it always does. That man now knows which way home lies. It is a miracle of magnetism, yes, but also of faith. For generations, sailors had trusted only what they could see. Now they were asked to trust what they could not. The compass became the bridge between human instinct and natural law. Europe, once bounded by fear of the unknown, began to look outward with confidence. Navigation ceased to be guesswork. The sea became measurable. Soon, engineers improved the design. The dry compass evolved into the mariner's compass, a magnetized needle attached to a compass card, floating in liquid to dampen movement. The box was mounted in gimbals, allowing it to remain level even as the ship pitched and rolled. A small, fragile invention had become the heartbeat of every voyage. But beneath its simplicity lay immense complexity. Why did it work? That question haunted philosophers for centuries. Some believed the compass contained trapped spirits of the poles. Others thought the heavens exerted invisible strings of power. It wasn't until much later that humanity understood. The earth itself was a magnet, an enormous bar of invisible force. Its poles, hidden deep within molten iron, created a field that reached into every compass ever made. Every voyage, every empire, every discovery, all of it rested on that unseen energy humming beneath the planet's skin. And so the compass became the first truly global instrument. The same device that guided a junk in the South China Sea could steer a galley in the Mediterranean or a caravel across the Atlantic. It did not care for language or kingdom. It obeyed only the planet. By the late Middle Ages, maps began to change to reflect this new trust. The north was no longer just a direction, it was an anchor. Cartographers centered their worlds upon it. Compass roses blossomed across parchment, each one a symbol of precision and control. Where once angels and monsters filled the margins of maps, now mathematical lines stretched across them. Order was winning over myth. Still, the compass had enemies. Some clerics called it unnatural, even heretical. They whispered that it defied divine will, that if God had intended man to sail beyond sight of land, he would have made the stars visible forever. In the age of faith, the compass was an act of quiet rebellion, a human hand reaching into the mechanics of the universe. But it was too late to turn back. The needle had already pointed humanity toward its destiny. In the ports of Lisbon and Seville, navigators gathered around wooden tables, compasses and charts spread before them. They plotted courses not by myth, but by mathematics. They spoke in the new language of azimuths, bearings, and declinations, words that transformed the sea from mystery into geometry. To sail now was to calculate. To explore was to measure. The compass did not only change where humanity could go, it changed how humanity thought. It taught generations to believe that the world, however vast, could be understood through observation, experiment, and reason. In that sense, the compass was not just a tool of navigation. It was the beginning of science itself. When the magnetic needle found north, humanity found curiosity. And yet, for all its precision, the compass was also deeply symbolic. It reminded every sailor of two truths: that the world was immense, and that within it, one could always find direction. It was both humbling and empowering, the perfect emblem of the human condition. Imagine the ship again, drifting through fog. The crew is exhausted, their faith fading. The helmsman opens the box and watches the needle twitch, then settle. In that moment, a calm spreads across the deck. The compass has spoken. The course is clear. They adjust the sails, set their heading, and move forward, not toward certainty, but toward hope. The ocean remains vast, the dangers real. But now, humanity possesses something greater than sight. It has orientation. From this silent revolution, everything else will follow. The drawing of maps, the exploration of coasts, the crossing of oceans, the birth of global trade, and the collision of worlds. It all begins with a small, trembling needle, a whisper of iron that forever altered the voice of history. In the shadows of candlelight, a new art was born, the craft of the mapmaker. Ink traced the limits of knowledge, and imagination filled in the rest. Where the compass pointed the way, the map gave it meaning. The compass, once a curiosity, became the beating heart of an age. But invention alone is never enough. It must be trusted, tested, and woven into the lives of those who dare to use it. In the harbors of the late medieval world, change moved slowly. Sailors, like all men of habit, feared new tools. They trusted their instincts, the color of the water, the smell of salt, the angle of the sun, not some silent needle whispering unseen truths. Yet, as the voyages lengthened and the horizons grew empty, the mariner's mind began to change. To understand the sea, he had to surrender to its logic, and the compass offered logic steady, measurable, immune to superstition. By the dawn of the 14th century, European shipwrights were building vessels capable of crossing seas that no man had dared to chart. The compass, refined and protected within its box of brass and oak, became a sacred object aboard every ship, often guarded as one guards a relic. Its small glass window reflected lantern light like an eye that never blinked. Sailors began marking their courses in degrees, a radical idea that turned motion into mathematics. A helmsman could now keep his heading through night and storm. He would glance down at the trembling needle, correct the rudder, and feel for the first time control over chaos. The compass had done something profound. It had given man the illusion, and soon, the reality that nature could be tamed. No longer did voyages rely solely on the fickle stars or the unpredictable coastline. Ships ventured farther, hugging the edge of the known world. The Mediterranean, once the entire stage of Western trade, began to feel small. The Atlantic called vast and gray, its winds cold and unmeasured. The compass answered that call. From the ports of Genoa, Venice, and Amalfi came charts and logbooks, detailed records of winds, bearings, and latitudes. These were not just merchant notes, they were the foundation of an empirical science. Sailors became scholars without realizing it. They tested, recorded, compared, and adjusted. They learned, often at the cost of lives, that the magnetic needle did not point to true north, but to something close, a mysterious force that drifted slightly west or east depending on where one sailed. They called it variation, and for centuries it puzzled them. Why would the Earth's invisible hand shift from place to place? Some said it was God's reminder that perfection belonged only to heaven. Others began to suspect something far more remarkable, that the world was not uniform, that its forces curved and changed with geography. In this discovery lay the seeds of modern science. From compass readings came the earliest understanding of the Earth as a living magnet, a sphere of molten iron whose unseen field guided both stone and man. Without realizing it, these sailors were charting not only the oceans, but the invisible structure of the planet itself. And yet, for all its precision, the compass remained intimate. Each captain trusted his own instrument more than any others. Many carried personal compasses blessed by priests, wrapped in silk, or kept hidden in carved boxes. They became talismans, symbols of destiny and defiance. When a ship sailed from Lisbon into the western horizon, where the maps faded to monsters and clouds, the compass became both anchor and oracle. Its needle never faltered, even when faith did. The sailors began to name it the hand of God in iron. Through storms, it glowed faintly under the lantern, marking north as if tracing the axis of the world. Around it, navigation transformed into ritual. Each dawn, the navigator opened his bussola, the compass box recorded its bearing, adjusted for drift, and entered the number into the ship's log. He would compare it to the stars at night, testing the needle's truth against the heavens. It was a dialogue between earth and sky magnetism below, constellations above. From this daily communion came the first rhumb lines, diagonal lines, on maps that allowed sailors to plot steady courses across wind and wave. Before long, cartographers began drawing elaborate compass roses on their charts, intricate wheels marked with 32 directions, each petal representing a possible path through the world. They were not mere decoration. They were the geometry of hope. For the first time in human history, a man could leave sight of land and still know, within reason, where he was going. The compass had turned the sea, once chaos, into a grid of possibilities. It also turned navigation into a profession, a craft defined by precision. No longer was the best sailor simply the bravest. He had to be the most observant, the most disciplined, the one who read not omens but instruments. The compass birthed a new breed, the navigator, scientist. These were men who kept records of currents, logged wind patterns, and studied how magnetism changed near different coasts. By the 15th century, these data gathered by generations of sailors began to converge into a single worldview, that the Earth could be measured, predicted, and mapped. That worldview was radical. It defied both myth and theology. The sea was no longer the realm of gods or monsters. It was a system vast, but knowable. And so, quietly, the compass ignited the Renaissance. For while the printing press spread knowledge on land, the compass spread it across the oceans. Every voyage was an experiment, every return a revelation. In the halls of Portugal's Sagres, where Prince Henry gathered mapmakers and navigators, compasses lay open beside astrolabes and crude globes. They were the tools of empire, but also of enlightenment. From these tables came the voyages that would redefine the world down the coast of Africa, around the Cape of Good Hope, and eventually, across the Atlantic itself. Each expedition began the same way, with a trembling needle finding north. The compass had transformed from an Eastern curiosity into the engine of Western expansion. It was the first piece of true global technology invented in one hemisphere, perfected in another, and shared by all. It connected the unknown to the known, the mysterious to the measurable. Even today, its simplicity humbles modern instruments. A bar magnet, a pivot, a degree scale, nothing more. Yet within it lies the logic of all exploration. Every satellite, every GPS, every digital map owes its lineage to that small, ancient needle floating in oil. The compass taught humanity something the stars never could. The truth lies not only above us, but beneath us in the invisible forces that shape our world. It is fitting, then, that sailors often spoke to their compass as if it were alive. They believed it could feel fear, sense storms, or lead them home out of pity. Superstition and science blended because, in the end, both were attempts to explain the same miracle, that iron could know the way. And perhaps, in some deep way, it did. Even centuries later, as explorers like Columbus and Magellan set sail into seas no map dared show, their confidence rested upon this one instrument. When all else failed, wind, star, and prayer, the compass endured. It was not infallible, but it was faithful. In its patient turning, the world found order. In its steady north, men found courage. By the time the 15th century ended, the compass had done more than guide ships. It had guided civilization itself away from myth toward measurement, away from isolation toward interconnection. Every empire that rose upon the sea, from Portugal to Spain, from England to Holland, carried within its fleets that same humble box. Every conquest, every trade route, every rediscovery of the planet began with a simple act. A sailor aligning his compass and whispering, "Hold true." And so, as the world's edges began to recede, and blank spaces on the map turned to coastlines and continents, the compass remained, the silent constant, the needle that had first dared to move when all others stood still. It was, and still is, humanity's quiet rebellion against uncertainty. There was a time when the world existed only as rumor. Before ink and compass conspired to give it form, the earth was a patchwork of imagination, seas filled with serpents, continents carved by faith. But by the late 13th and early 14th centuries, something profound began to stir across the ports and monasteries of Europe. The compass had given men direction. Now they hungered for vision. If the compass told them where they were going, the map promised to show what the world looked like. It began not in royal courts or academies, but in the quiet corners of docks, where sailors sketched coastlines in the margins of logbooks, tracing the bends of familiar shores. These crude sketches, lines of memory, not measurement, soon evolved into something new. Men started comparing notes, aligning bearings from their compass with distance sailed, and slowly, the first portolan charts were born. They were unlike anything before them. Unlike the symbolic mappe mundi that filled medieval cathedrals where Jerusalem sat at the center of a divine cosmos, the portolan charts were tools, not prayers. They were raw, pragmatic, and astonishingly accurate. Coastlines from Spain to the Black Sea appeared with startling precision, dotted with harbors, rivers, and landmarks, all connected by a web of radiating lines, the rum lines of the navigator's compass. Each line spoke a single truth. Direction mattered more than myth. These maps became the visual language of an emerging scientific world. To hold one was to hold power, the power to move, to plan, to command. Venetian merchants guarded them as jealously as gold. A single chart, copied by hand, might cost more than a sailor's lifetime of wages. But what made these maps truly revolutionary was their fusion of art and mathematics. Each coastline was drawn by eye, yet confirmed by angle. Each journey added another line, another correction. It was collective genius, anonymous, iterative, relentless. The world, for the first time, began to come into focus not through divine revelation, but through accumulated human experience. Still, the mapmakers were not free of superstition. Along the edges of every chart lurked the unknown, marked with phrases like, "Here be dragons," or adorned with painted beasts breaching the waves. These were not warnings so much as acknowledgments. Beyond this line, knowledge fails. Yet those monsters served a purpose. They made the maps feel alive, breathing with mystery, whispering challenge. For every sailor who saw them, they were both a threat and a promise. And so, maps became more than guides. They became dreams. To unroll a chart was to glimpse destiny. The parchment, speckled with salt and soot, carried the weight of countless voyages. Each mark told a story, a near wreck on the rocks of Crete, a storm survived off the coast of Lisbon, a star sighted through clouds after 7 days of blindness. In time, a strange transformation took place. Maps ceased to be mirrors of experience and began to dictate it. Captains now trusted ink as much as instinct. If the map said a coast existed, they sailed toward it, even if their eyes saw only mist. The imagined became real through belief and repetition. This was the beginning of the cartographic paradox. Maps create the world they claim to describe. As the 14th century waned, the art of mapmaking spread northward. In the island kingdoms of England and the Hanseatic ports of the Baltic, scholars and sailors worked side by side. They refined measurements, compared notes, and experimented with new projections. Then came the breakthrough that would redefine everything: the idea of the globe. It seems simple to us now, yet at the time, to imagine the earth as a sphere rather than a divine flat expanse bordered by heaven was an act of quiet rebellion. The Greeks had speculated it centuries earlier, but only now did evidence the curvature of the horizon, the shadow of Earth on the moon, the arc of the stars begin to demand acceptance. Somewhere in the dimly lit workshop of a Mediterranean craftsman, the first terrestrial globe took shape, a wooden sphere, wrapped in painted vellum. Lines of latitude and longitude scratched faintly across its surface. It was crude, but it was revelation. For the first time, humanity held its home in its hands. But the globe, for all its wonder, carried a danger. It implied completeness. To map the world was to believe it could be known that mystery itself had borders. And yet, the mapmakers knew better. Each time they corrected a coastline or redrew a strait, they saw how fragile their truth was. The sea did not yield easily to geometry. Currents shifted sandbanks. Storms erased landmarks. Continents curved in ways that no straight line could ever capture. To map was to chase perfection and to fail beautifully. Still, that failure drove innovation. As compasses improved and ships ventured farther, maps grew bolder. The Portuguese, masters of precision, developed rudders, detailed sailing directions, combining bearing, distance, and magnetic variation. By the early 15th century, Lisbon had become the cartographic capital of Europe. There, under the patronage of Prince Henry the Navigator, a generation of mapmakers set out to do the impossible: join East and West on parchment. They collected Arabic star charts, African trade records, and whispered reports from travelers who claimed to have seen lands beyond the horizon. Slowly, the world began to fit together imperfectly, but enough to ignite imagination. It was here that the map ceased to be a record and became a prophecy. When Columbus studied the charts of Toscanelli, he saw not what existed but what might. The maps told him Asia lay across the Western Sea, only a few weeks' sail away. They were wrong, fatally wrong, yet their errors made history move. Had the maps been accurate, Columbus might never have sailed. In this sense, every voyage of discovery was born from a cartographic mistake. The world, in being mapped, was misimagined, and through that misimagination, found anew. To draw a line was to declare a possibility, and every possibility changed the course of empires. As map-making evolved, so too did its instruments. The compass remained its heart, but new tools emerged: the astrolabe, the cross-staff, and eventually, the quadrant, all designed to measure the sky with increasing precision. These tools allowed sailors to calculate latitude, turning the ocean from mystery into mathematics. Yet longitude, the measurement of east and west, remained elusive. Without accurate clocks, sailors drifted in uncertainty, their maps expanding but always slightly wrong. That problem would haunt humanity for centuries. Still, in the candlelit rooms of monasteries and merchant guilds, cartographers kept drawing. They drew because to stop drawing was to admit defeat. Every ink line was an act of faith that the world could be known, that chaos could be translated into order. Their maps became works of art, shimmering with gold leaf and sea green pigment. Angels blew winds from the corners. Compass roses blossomed like flowers across the oceans. Ships, drawn in exquisite detail, sailed eternally toward their destinations. And beneath the beauty lay geometry, the quiet mathematics that underpinned empire, conquest, and curiosity. By the time the 15th century dawned, Europe's maps had outgrown Europe itself. They no longer fit within theology or myth. They demanded expansion. Every new voyage required new parchment, new ink, new courage. The sea was not shrinking, humanity was growing. Thus, from the marriage of compass and map was born the Age of Discovery, an age where the ink of cartographers guided the steel of explorers, and together they would redraw not only the shape of the world, but the shape of human destiny itself. In the early morning mist of Lisbon, the river shimmered like polished metal, reflecting a sky pale with dawn. Inside a narrow room overlooking the docks, a man bent over a sheet of vellum stretched across a table. His fingers trembled as he dipped a quill into ink the color of midnight. Every stroke he made carried the weight of a world not yet known. He was no sailor, no warrior, but the lines he drew would guide both armies and empires. The hum of the harbor filled the air, creaking masts, distant voices, and the slap of water against hulls. Yet in that room, the only sound was the whisper of ink on skin. Each map began as a confession of ignorance. Beyond the coastlines that sailors described, there was only speculation. But speculation, when disciplined by geometry, became prophecy. A cartographer's world was equal parts faith and mathematics. He listened to returning sailors speak of lands rising from fog, of stars brighter in southern skies, of winds that changed without warning. He turned their stories into coastlines, their fear into contour. A single misplaced line could doom a voyage. A single accurate one could build an empire. For these men, ink was destiny. By the 15th century, the art of map-making had escaped the monasteries and entered the chambers of kings. Maps were no longer instruments of curiosity, they were weapons of control. Monarchs ordered them not to understand the world, but to possess it. Venice guarded its charts like holy relics. Portugal treated them as state secrets. Spain used them as declarations of intent. To claim a line on parchment was to claim the land beneath it, and to erase one was to erase a nation. The cartographers knew this. Every commission carried risk. A misplaced border could start a war. An unapproved discovery could be punished as treason. In the candlelit workshops of Venice, guilds of mapmakers worked like alchemists. They blended pigment from crushed minerals, mixed gold dust into paint, and stretched animal skin until it was thin as light. Sailors came to them with sketches drawn on driftwood or carved into shells. They brought rumors from ports whose names no one could pronounce. The mapmakers gathered these fragments like archaeologists of possibility. Piece by piece, they stitched the world together, not always accurately, but always beautifully. Each map was both a document and a dream. By the 15th century, the art of mapmaking had escaped the monasteries and entered the chambers of kings. Maps were no longer instruments of curiosity, they were weapons of control. Monarchs ordered them not to understand the world, but to possess it. Venice guarded its charts like holy relics. Portugal treated them as state secrets. Spain used them as declarations of intent. To claim a line on parchment was to claim the land beneath it, and to erase one was to erase a nation. In that pursuit, Portugal built not just ships, but certainty. Piece by piece, they stitched the world together, not always accurately, but always beautifully. Each map was both a document and a dream. By the 15th century, the art of mapmaking had escaped the monasteries and entered the chambers of kings. Maps were no longer instruments of curiosity, they were weapons of control. Monarchs ordered them not to understand the world, but to possess it. Venice guarded its charts like holy relics. Portugal treated them as state secrets. Spain used them as declarations of intent. To claim a line on parchment was to claim the land beneath it, and to erase one was to erase a nation. In Lisbon, the craft took on the precision of science. Prince Henry, the navigator, though he rarely left the Portuguese coast, understood the power of information. He gathered astronomers, mathematicians, and cartographers at Sagres, a fortress overlooking the restless Atlantic. Together, they compared celestial charts with sailors' tales, tested compasses, and recalculated the distances between stars and harbors. They sought to turn the chaos of the sea into something measurable. To map the earth was to honor both reason and wonder. The divine was not absent from their geometry, it lived within it. But as the century turned, belief began to yield to observation. Mariners tested what priests had preached. They sailed through regions once feared as cursed, and they returned alive. The sea monsters faded from the maps. The angels disappeared. The coastlines sharpened. The ocean was no longer a mystery guarded by gods. It was an equation waiting to be solved. Then came the voyage that changed everything. When Columbus unrolled his maps aboard the Santa Maria, he trusted not in luck but in ink. He believed the charts that showed Asia just beyond the western horizon. What he found instead was a continent no map had ever imagined. The world itself had lied. In one stroke of discovery, every chart in Europe became obsolete. Yet in that failure lay triumph. The purpose of a map was not to be correct, it was to inspire movement. The unknown had not destroyed the known, it had expanded it. News of Columbus's return raced across Europe like fire through dry parchment. In Venice and Lisbon, the workshops erupted with feverish energy. Old maps were scraped clean, new ones redrawn. Cartographers worked through the night, their rooms glowing with candlelight and ambition. The faint outlines of the Americas began to appear tentative, fragile, uncertain. Each curve of coast was a guess, each bay a question. But for the first time, the world was no longer imagined in halves. The Atlantic, once a border of fear, had become a bridge. The more the world took shape, the more dangerous the maps became. A coastline was not just geography, it was opportunity. Gold, spices, slaves, faith, all moved along lines first drawn in ink. In 1494, the Treaty of Tordesillas divided the earth between Spain and Portugal along a single invisible meridian. The men who drew that line never set sail. They wielded quills, not swords, but their decision would define centuries of conquest. The pen, for a time, ruled the sea. For the cartographers, pride mixed with guilt. They had turned imagination into empire. They had given power form. Yet, as empires rose and fell, they remained in their quiet rooms, bent over tables, doing what they always had, trying to make sense of the infinite. Every voyage that began with a prayer ended on their desks, translated into ink and numbers. They were chroniclers of human restlessness. And though most of their names are forgotten, the world they drew still exists within ours. As the 16th century dawned, map-making became a science in earnest. Astronomers began measuring magnetic variations across the oceans, noting that the compass needle pointed slightly west of north in some regions, slightly east in others. Navigators kept detailed logs of latitudes, stars, and wind directions. Slowly, the planet began to reveal its shape not as myth, but as mathematics. Each discovery made the next possible. The Earth was becoming a system to be understood, not a mystery to be feared. The world was still too large, and paper too small, to contain its truth. That was the paradox that kept the cartographers working the pursuit of completion in a world that refused to be complete. They became archivists of human imagination. Surrounded by silence, parchment, and the faint smell of salt carried in on sailors' cloaks, they continued their endless labor. Outside, ships left port carrying dreams stitched together from their work. Inside, the mapmakers traced the boundaries of those dreams. Their legacy was not just in the lines they drew, but in the hunger they awakened, the hunger to know, to see, to go. In the end, the maps were never truly about geography. They were about possibility. To draw the world was to declare that it could be known, that distance could be conquered, that fear could be measured. Each chart was a mirror, reflecting not what the earth was, but what humanity wished it to be. Through them, courage found direction, and curiosity found form. And as the world's edges began to fade into shape, a new challenge rose from the horizon. Maps could show where to go, but not how to survive the journey. The ocean demanded more than knowledge. It demanded mastery. It called for ships capable of holding against the wind, of bending wood and canvas to will. The next chapter of discovery would not be written in ink, but in timber and sail, forged by the craftsmen who understood the language of the sea itself. Because the maps had done their part, they had shown the way. Now, humanity would have to learn how to follow it. The sea stretched endlessly, a restless expanse of gray and blue, each wave a whisper of the unknown. Sailors gazed over the railings of wooden decks, feeling the pull of the wind and the sway of their ships, hearts caught between fear and fascination. These vessels, born of centuries of trial and error, were no mere floating platforms. They were instruments of human ingenuity, finely tuned to harness the breath of the heavens. Every plank, every joint, every sail was the result of observation, measurement, and a stubborn refusal to surrender to the unpredictability of the open ocean. The caravel, with its triangular lateen sails, danced with the wind in ways that older galleys never could. It could tack, zigzagging against the breeze, turning a limitation into an advantage. Hulls were carefully shaped to balance stability and speed, to resist the battering of storm-driven waves while still cutting cleanly through the water. Shipwrights worked with an intimate knowledge of physics, even if they lacked the formal equations that later generations would write. The curvature of a keel, the angle of a mast, the tension of ropes all demanded precision born from experience. A miscalculation could mean the difference between a triumphant crossing and a wooden coffin drifting into the abyss. Timber was chosen not only for strength but for elasticity, the way it flexed and absorbed the shocks of the sea. Every nail, every rope, every block and tackle contributed to a harmony of forces, a silent symphony of mechanics that allowed men to venture where maps only dared hint. In the quiet moments before dawn, the crew would adjust the sails with almost ritual precision, feeling the wind's subtle shifts as though the ship itself were a living organism, breathing, responding, anticipating. The steering oar, then later the stern rudder, transformed control over these floating beasts. No longer were ships slaves to the currents alone. They could pivot, angle, and maneuver with a skill that mirrored the deftness of a dancer. The combination of sail and rudder allowed captains to exploit the wind's energy fully, to carry men and cargo across vast, uncertain oceans. Caravels and carracks became the vessels of ambition, engines for discovery, their designs embodying both art and science. Every voyage was a lesson in applied mechanics, understanding the lift generated by the wind on a triangular sail, the drag against a hull's bow, the shifting center of gravity as cargo and crew moved with the sea. Captains learned to read the subtle cues of rigging and rope tension, to anticipate the gusts that would either propel or threaten to capsize them. At night, under the vault of stars, the ship seemed alive in a way that went beyond their timbers and sails. Each creak and groan of the hull was a language understood by the crew. Each whisper of wind through the rigging, a signal to adjust, to prepare. Navigation became a blend of instinct, observation, and early science. The vessels themselves were instruments, translating the invisible forces of wind and water into motion, a tangible dialogue between human intention and natural law. Storms tested every element of design. Decks were swept by waves, masts bent under relentless gusts, and yet the ships endured because the builders had learned to respect the physics that governed their every part. Trade and exploration pushed the limits of these vessels. The Mediterranean's calm gave way to the Atlantic's unpredictability. Sailors ventured further, each journey a test of design, each crossing a verification of theory in practice. Shipwrights in Lisbon, Venice, and Genoa compared notes, sharing innovations like the curve of a bow, the shape of a sail, the placement of ballast. These exchanges of knowledge were as vital as the maps themselves. Across oceans, sailors depended on the reliability of a vessel engineered to anticipate the worst while taking advantage of the best. And with every crossing, human understanding of the sea's physical laws grew not yet formalized in textbooks, but alive in hands calloused by rope, in eyes scanning waves, in minds calculating angles of attack and drift. Inside the hulls, life was cramped, and yet efficiency demanded order. Storage of water and provisions affected balance, and the careful distribution of weight became another application of practical physics. A ship leaning too far to one side could capsize, too low in the water, and waves might breach the deck. Every load, every chest, every barrel became part of a delicate equilibrium. Sailors developed a rhythm, a choreography to their work that echoed the principles of leverage, momentum, and resistance. A winch or block and tackle could amplify strength, allowing a handful of men to move heavy cargo or adjust sails against formidable winds. Here, human muscle met mechanical advantage, and the two combined to command the raw forces of nature. The bow of the ship rose and fell with each swell, the figurehead slicing through foam and spray. Above, the sails swelled with wind, taut as drumheads, vibrating with the energy that would carry men to new worlds. It was a partnership with nature, not a battle against it. The most successful captains learned that brute force alone could not conquer the seas. Understanding the subtle interplay of wind, current, and ship design was essential. The caravel, with its maneuverability and endurance, became the symbol of a new age, a vessel capable of carrying ambition across the boundless horizon. Each voyage became a proving ground for maritime science. The angles of sails, the resistance of hulls, the efficiency of oars in calm waters, all were tested repeatedly. Ships evolved, adapting to storms, reefs, and open waters. Timber was seasoned, joints reinforced, and innovations in rigging applied. Slowly, empiricism shaped design, the accumulated wisdom of countless crossings, informing the construction of the next generation. Shipwrights and navigators formed an unspoken partnership. One designed, the other tested, and together they pushed the boundaries of human possibility. Through these ships, the imagination of men became tangible. They were not simply carriers of goods or soldiers. They were vessels of dreams, embodying the desire to confront the unknown, to bridge continents, to map the unmapped. And as sails caught the wind and hulls cleaved the waves, the legacy of these early innovations would ripple through history, laying the foundation for global exploration and the dawn of the age of discovery. Every knot of rope, Every carved beam, every tightened sail was an expression of human ingenuity, a triumph of observation, experimentation, and courage in the face of the infinite ocean. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sea in molten gold and purple, the ships rode the swell with a measured grace, their hulls groaning softly under the strain of timber and tide. Crews moved with practiced precision, adjusting sails, tightening ropes, and checking the angle of rudders as the wind shifted. Every motion was a calculation, every adjustment a response to the subtle language of the sea. The caravel's lateen sails caught the fading light, their triangular shapes slicing the wind with uncanny efficiency. On deck, the air was thick with salt spray, the smell of tar, and the quiet determination of men who had come to understand that survival depended not on strength alone but on skill, patience, and observation. Navigating such vessels demanded more than simple seamanship. The art of tacking against the wind required a knowledge of forces, lift and drag, angle and momentum, resistance and acceleration. Captains watched the sails, felt the pull of ropes through calloused hands, and anticipated the response of the ship's hull before it fully manifested in motion. Each tack was a dialogue between man, ship, and wind, a negotiation with the elements that tested intuition and experience. The slightest miscalculation could send the vessel drifting off course, or, worse, into dangerous shallows. For this reason, knowledge of the ship's design, the curvature of the hull, the flexibility of the masts, the tension in the rigging was as critical as understanding the stars or the currents. Below deck, the interplay of weight and balance was an invisible force guiding every journey. Provisions, water, and cargo were arranged meticulously, each barrel and chest placed to preserve stability. Sailors moved with rhythm, their footfalls and heaving of ropes adding to the harmony of motion. When waves struck the ship's side, the hull flexed, absorbing shocks. When gusts lashed the sails, the timbers groaned but held firm. The vessel was alive in its responsiveness, a testament to the skill of the shipwrights who had forged it from raw timber, iron, and rope. Each plank was shaped for both strength and resilience, each joint tested against months at sea, and each design choice a small but vital contribution to the ship's endurance. Innovation was constant. Caravels evolved into larger carracks, capable of carrying more supplies and navigating further into uncharted waters. Shipbuilders experimented with reinforced hulls to resist hidden reefs and storm-tossed waves. They refined rigging systems, improving control and speed. Every crossing became an experiment in applied mechanics, where human ingenuity met the raw power of the ocean. The feedback loop between observation and adaptation was relentless. Lessons learned on one voyage informed designs for the next, and small improvements multiplied over decades to create vessels capable of spanning entire oceans. The ships themselves became instruments of empire. As fleets departed Lisbon, Venice, and Seville, they carried more than cargo and men. They carried knowledge, ambition, and a growing understanding of global currents. Sailors mapped coasts and charted winds, transmitting this empirical data back to cartographers and shipwrights. Timber from one region might be replaced with a stronger variety from another. A new sail configuration might be tested against a particular wind pattern. The vessels were simultaneously laboratories and classrooms, places where observation, trial, and error combined to refine the craft of navigation and construction. Each voyage was punctuated by moments of awe and terror. Storms tested the limits of hull strength, battering decks with unrelenting force, while waves threatened to break masts and tear sails. In these moments, the ingenuity of design was revealed. The flexibility of a well-seasoned hull allowed it to ride the swells rather than resist them. Reinforced masts bent without snapping, ropes strained against wind and water, distributing forces evenly to prevent catastrophic failure. Human skill merged with material science, creating a dynamic equilibrium between men, machines, and nature. Even in calm seas, mastery of the ship's mechanics was essential. Subtle currents, unseen under the placid surface, could push a vessel off course over hundreds of miles. Sailors relied on the principles of leverage, friction, and balance as they adjusted oars, winches, and pulleys. The combination of natural observation and mechanical advantage turned labor into precise action, Each adjustment amplified human effort, allowing small crews to manage vessels of impressive size and complexity. The integration of physics into daily practice was intuitive, embedded in muscle memory, and in the silent understanding that every knot tied and every rope pulled contributed to survival and success. At night, navigation intertwined with the heavens. Captains consulted the stars, adjusting their course in harmony with celestial positions. Yet even with the guidance of constellations, the ship itself remained a central actor in the voyage. Its design dictated how efficiently it responded to wind and current, how quickly it could alter direction, and how safely it could weather the night's uncertainties. Each component, from the angle of the rudder to the tension of the mizzen, was a lesson in applied mechanics, honed through countless crossings. The wind, ever capricious, became both a teacher and an ally. Sailors learned to read its subtle cues: the shimmer of whitecaps, the changing scent of salt, the microshifts in sail tension. Their responses were guided by experience and an understanding of the ship's structure. The dance between vessel and element was intricate, demanding constant attention and adjustment. Mistakes could be fatal, but success brought a unique mastery, a sense of communion with forces far larger than oneself. By the time dawn broke, painting the horizon with pink and amber light, the ships had traveled miles with a grace that belied their mass and complexity. Sailors felt the rhythm of their vessels as naturally as their own heartbeat. Each crossing contributed to a growing body of knowledge, building the foundation for the great voyages yet to come. In every knot, every timber, and every sail, the principles of physics, material science, and mechanics were encoded not as abstract theories, but as lived experience, practiced and perfected through repetition and observation. These ships were more than vehicles. They were extensions of human ambition, embodiments of ingenuity, and instruments through which mankind reached for horizons previously unimaginable. The Atlantic, vast and merciless, became navigable not through luck, but through understanding, adaptation, and the careful orchestration of wind, wood, and human effort. The caravel and its descendants were the culmination of centuries of design, observation, and experimentation, bridging continents and shaping history. Every journey affirmed a profound truth: mastery over the sea required not only courage, but also intellect, precision, and a deep respect for the forces that governed the natural world. As the first light touched the decks, sailors felt the pulse of possibility. The wind filled the sails, carrying them toward new lands, new discoveries, and a world that was only beginning to reveal itself. These ships, crafted with care and understanding, were the vehicles of human curiosity, translating ambition into motion and dreams into reality. And through them, the age of exploration truly began. Propelled by wind, guided by knowledge, and sustained by the ceaseless courage of those who dared to leave the familiar shores behind. Night fell over the deck of the caravel, a velvet darkness punctuated by the glitter of stars. Sailors moved like shadows across the rigging, their eyes scanning the heavens as if seeking counsel from the constellations themselves. The ocean stretched beyond sight, a restless expanse of silvered waves under the lantern's faint glow, whispering secrets that only the boldest captains dared to interpret. To venture into the unknown, a mariner had to trust not in landmarks or familiar harbors, but in the subtle, unerring movements of the cosmos. The astrolabe, a delicate instrument of brass, gleamed in the hand of the navigator. Its arc traced the path of the sun at noon, capturing the angle between the horizon and the celestial body, translating the invisible mathematics of the sky into a language that sailors could understand. With each careful measurement, latitude was revealed, a number that promised direction across a liquid desert. Shadows lengthened and shrank, the sun's movement marking not only time but place, an intimate partnership between celestial motion and human ingenuity. Above, Polaris shone with steadfast certainty. Unlike the shifting stars, this solitary beacon offered a point of reference, a fixed northern light guiding the way. Navigators learned to read it, to measure its angle above the horizon, and in that number found their north. The night became a classroom of infinite scale, where the laws of motion and gravity were enacted in silence. Every star held information, a map drawn not on parchment but in light and distance, waiting for those patient enough to decipher it. The sextant, though a later innovation, was anticipated in the careful observations of these early mariners. They understood intuitively the principles of angular measurement, the geometry that allowed them to translate the heavens into courses and bearings. Each reading demanded precision. A single degree miscalculated could mean hundreds of miles lost, swallowed by the merciless Atlantic. Yet despite the risks, they persevered, combining courage with observation, instinct with calculation. Clouds drifted across the sky, veiling the stars, and sailors cursed softly, for the instruments were useless without visibility. They learned to measure the sun's altitude before it disappeared, to record angles meticulously in the captain's log, to trust in repeated observation. These records, scribbled in ink and sand, became the first archives of empirical science on the ocean. Knowledge accumulated slowly, tested by waves, wind, and human error, forming a corpus that would guide future generations beyond the sight of land. The moon rose, casting a silver path over the restless waves, its own rhythm dictating tides and currents. Sailors observed the swell, the timing of high and low water, the direction of flow, combining empirical knowledge with celestial navigation. Each voyage was a lesson in physics, friction, buoyancy, momentum, the subtle effects of wind on canvas. The ship itself became an instrument of study, its movements providing feedback as the crew adjusted sails, corrected course, and learned to read the invisible hands that moved both sea and sky. Amid the work, whispers of wonder passed between men. A new star, a comet's trail, the uncanny alignment of planets. To them, these were not omens but signposts, phenomena that could be quantified, studied, and integrated into navigation. Maps were no longer only lines on parchment. They were projections of experience, of repeated observation, of the laws of nature inscribed into human understanding. Mariners became astronomers, physicists, and cartographers simultaneously, bridging the abstract and the tangible. On the horizon, the first hint of dawn painted the waves with rose and gold. Sailors paused, instruments in hand, measuring the sun's ascent to verify latitude. The calculations would dictate the next leg of the journey, guiding the ship through channels unseen, past shoals, and hidden reefs. Each degree mattered. Every observation could preserve life or lead to catastrophe. It was a delicate interplay between daring and diligence, faith in tools and faith in the cosmos itself. Back in the captain's cabin, charts were unrolled, inked lines representing what could not be seen directly. Currents, prevailing winds, and stellar bearings converged in an intricate dance of prediction and adjustment. Sailors compared observations, reconciled contradictions, and refined methods. An iterative process not unlike the laboratories of learned men in distant courts and universities. Here, on a rolling deck in the vast Atlantic, science was alive, enacted in real time against the theater of waves and wind. Each night, as stars wheeled overhead, sailors recorded the constellations' positions, plotted courses, and adjusted for drift. The instruments were crude by later standards, yet they sufficed. Observation was the key, repeated and verified. Knowledge grew cumulatively, a living, breathing map that expanded with each crossing. The sky was both compass and teacher, the sea a testing ground, and every voyage a proof of the delicate marriage between human curiosity and natural law. Amid the ocean's vast uncertainty, confidence emerged from understanding. The mariner who could measure, calculate, and observe could conquer distance, outwit storms, and chart courses previously thought impossible. Each entry in the log was a triumph over chaos, a testament to intellect and courage interwoven. Stars, shadows, and science combined to form a framework upon which the age of exploration was built, a discipline that turned fear into mastery and unknown waters into pathways of discovery. The first light of morning ignited the horizon, reflecting in the polished brass of the astrolabe. Sailors, exhausted but vigilant, prepared the ship for the day's trials. They moved with purpose, guided by knowledge that was equal parts inherited tradition and fresh observation. The night's measurements would dictate their path, their survival, and perhaps their destiny. The Atlantic was vast and merciless, yet through stars and shadows, the Intrepid learned to bend its unpredictability to human will, stepping further into the age of navigation, where courage and calculation converged to redefine the known world. As dawn broke fully over the restless Atlantic, the ship's deck glimmered with dew and salt. Sailors moved with practiced precision, adjusting sails and measuring the wind's subtle shifts. The astrolabe and other instruments rested at the navigator's elbow, instruments of salvation in a sea without landmarks. Each reading from the night before was cross-checked, the results logged meticulously. Errors were recorded with solemnity, not shame. They were lessons, and lessons were life itself. The ship was an extension of human intellect, the vessel itself a living classroom upon the waves. The winds that had seemed capricious the previous evening now whispered a language understood by the seasoned crew. Observations of cloud formations, the swell of the waves, and the sudden flash of light across the horizon guided decisions more reliable than fear or superstition. A distant gull, wheeling over the open sea, suggested proximity to land, a faint possibility that sent ripples of anticipation through the men. Yet it was the combination of celestial guidance and careful observation that truly shaped their path. Navigators had learned to account for more than the stars themselves. Currents pulled the ship silently, unseen, yet inexorable. Tides rose and fell with mechanical certainty, yet varied with lunar cycles and coastal shapes. Each factor was meticulously noted, every subtle deviation analyzed. It was a science born of necessity. Empiricism formed on the edge of life and death. Charts evolved, becoming not just records of coastlines but complex systems integrating wind, tide, and stellar navigation. These records, carefully maintained, were treasure maps of experience, guiding future explorers toward successes the present sailors might only dream of. At midday, the sun arced high, piercing through drifting clouds, and the crew recalibrated their instruments. The shadow cast by the mast onto the deck became a rudimentary gnomon, a tool for measuring latitude, a practice refined over generations of experimentation. Observations were taken methodically, the angle recorded, then converted into degrees. Calculations were checked against previous logs, a process requiring concentration under the sun's glare and the constant sway of the deck. Mistakes could be fatal, yet precision brought confidence, and confidence was currency in the vast expanse of the Atlantic. Even as calculations dictated course, the human element remained essential. The captain, weathered by countless crossings, interpreted subtle hints invisible to instruments, the scent of salt on the wind, the patterns of birds in flight, the movement of plankton in the water. These indicators, often dismissed by theoretical scholars, were invaluable. The marriage of rigorous measurement and instinct created navigators capable of crossing oceans before the age of scientific instrumentation had matured fully. The stars at night continued to serve as guides. Each constellation, each fixed point in the sky, offered a reference not only for direction, but for survival. Sailors memorized patterns, recognizing variations and anomalies. They knew when to trust the heavens and when to defer to experience. Nights were long, cold, and often terrifying. Yet in the faint glow of lamps and lanterns, charts were drawn, compasses consulted, and courses plotted. Knowledge accumulated incrementally, validated by trial and, at times, catastrophe. As the voyage progressed, instruments were refined. Astrolabes became more precise. The mathematics of angles and arcs were applied with increasing sophistication. Each reading informed not just immediate navigation, but broader understanding of the Atlantic's currents, the timing of trade winds, and seasonal pattern. Mariners were, in effect, scientists at sea, blending observation, measurement, and application into a discipline that would shape centuries of exploration. Even in moments of calm, the ocean tested them. Sudden squalls appeared without warning. Clouds obscured the stars, and waves rose unpredictably. Sailors leaned on calculations and prior knowledge to guide responses. Lines were adjusted, ballast shifted, and the ship itself became a tool for experimentation, responding to natural forces as a laboratory might respond to controlled stimuli. Each correction reinforced understanding, building intuition alongside empirical knowledge. The nights remained the crucible of discovery. Sailors took readings of planetary positions, noted the moon's phase, and triangulated positions using multiple stars. Observations were shared, debated, and verified in a communal effort to ensure survival and progress. The horizon was both a physical and intellectual challenge, endless, shifting, and unforgiving. Yet through persistence and careful study, mariners transformed uncertainty into mastery, turning the night sky into a map and their instruments into extensions of reason. By the time the horizon hinted at the first distant shores of unknown lands, every sailor understood the magnitude of what had been accomplished. They had navigated vast distances using tools barely beyond the grasp of imagination a generation before. Each voyage was a synthesis of courage, intellect, and observation. The lessons learned were as tangible as the wood of the ship or the metal of the astrolabe. They were etched into the mind, guiding men toward further discoveries. And so, as the ship approached new lands, the discipline of observation, the rigor of celestial calculation, and the courage to venture beyond the known coalesced into triumph. The age of navigation was not merely a period of discovery. It was a testament to human ingenuity, the successful marriage of science and daring, theory and practice. The Atlantic, once feared as the edge of the world, had become a canvas upon which intellect and bravery painted the first strokes of a global map. Sailors recorded the day's findings meticulously, aware that these observations would serve generations to come. They carried knowledge as precious as gold: angles of stars, the movement of currents, and the subtle interplay of wind and water. The ship itself, its timbers worn yet resilient, was a repository of experience. Its crew both witness and participant in an unfolding scientific revolution conducted on the vastest stage imaginable. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the deck, the night sky reclaimed its dominion. Stars shimmered above like points of infinite guidance, each a reminder that discovery demanded patience, intellect, and courage. In the silence between the waves and the stars, sailors recognized the immense power of knowledge applied at sea. Instruments, observation, and calculation had transformed fear into understanding, chaos into order, and the unknown into a path toward human ambition. By the final hours before dawn, every course plotted, every star observed, every measurement recorded represented not just survival but mastery. The ship sailed on, a symbol of exploration and intellect, poised to continue the journey into the uncharted. The Atlantic was vast, but through science, courage, and determination, it had been made navigable. The foundations of modern navigation had been laid, brick by brick, measurement by measurement, voyage by voyage. The age of exploration had arrived, and the stars, shadows, and science had paved the way. The sun rose over Lisbon Harbor, gilding the calm waters with gold and fire. Ships rocked gently, their timbers creaking like ancient voices whispering the promise of distant lands. In the bustling port, sailors, merchants, and cartographers moved with synchronized urgency, aware that the horizon was no longer a limit but a challenge to be met. Flags fluttered, ropes strained, and the scent of tar and salt filled the air, a sensory symphony announcing the dawn of a new era. On the docks, young navigators studied portolan charts with intense focus. Each line and symbol carried the weight of knowledge accumulated over centuries. The eddies of currents, the regularity of trade winds, the subtle shifts of coastal shapes. These maps were more than tools. They were bridges between imagination and reality, between fear and ambition. Here, ambition was currency, and the masters of the compass and quill were wealthier than kings, for their wisdom would guide empires across uncharted oceans. Across the city, workshops hummed with the steady rhythm of hammers on metal and chisels on wood. Ships were being refitted, timber shaped to withstand Atlantic storms, hulls reinforced with iron nails, and masts carefully measured for balance. Every beam was weighed, every rope inspected, every sail folded and unfolded countless times to ensure flawless performance. It was a dance of precision, human skill harmonized with the unyielding laws of physics, preparing vessels to confront the sea in all its fury. In the courts of kings and princes, ambition met politics. Monarchs invested heavily in expeditions, each decision weighed against promises of gold, spices, and prestige. Advisors debated relentlessly. Should ships venture past the familiar straits, where legends spoke of sea serpents and disappearing horizons? Sailors, cartographers, and scientists presented calculations, noting currents, stellar patterns, and lunar cycles. Each council was a balance of risk and reward, a negotiation between the desire for glory and the limits of human endurance. As fleets were assembled, discipline became paramount. Sailors were trained not only in handling sails and rudders, but in reading the skies, interpreting currents, and understanding the subtle interplay of wind and wave. Knowledge of celestial navigation, combined with the precise use of compasses and charts, transformed men into explorers capable of crossing vast distances with unprecedented confidence. Each voyage was as much an experiment as it was a mission. Hypotheses tested on waves, observations logged meticulously, and errors corrected with a mixture of urgency and humility. From the workshops of Lisbon to the arsenals of Seville, the tools of exploration multiplied. Compasses were refined, marked with careful calibrations to withstand the tilt of the ship. Astrolabes and early sextants were adjusted to provide maximum accuracy. Cartographers perfected portolan charts, adding depth, notation, and practical instructions alongside decorative flourishes. Each innovation reduced uncertainty, converting a world of fear into a world of calculated possibility. Onboard captains and navigators cultivated trust among crews through shared responsibility. Every man understood that survival depended on cooperation, observation, and responsiveness to subtle environmental cues. The interplay of human intuition with rigorous observation created an ecosystem of knowledge. The success of the journey relied on both experience and science, the visible and the invisible, the tangible hull beneath their feet, and the intangible guidance of stars above. As ships prepared to leave port, final provisions were stored meticulously. Barrels of fresh water, salted meat, flour, and dried fruits. Every ration was calculated for duration, weight, and balance. Excess weight could slow progress, but insufficient supplies meant disaster. Even this mundane aspect of preparation was a delicate equation, combining arithmetic, foresight, and practical knowledge gleaned from previous voyages. Once the fleet set sail, they entered the vast Atlantic, an environment simultaneously familiar and alien. Currents shifted, waves rose unpredictably, and storms appeared without warning. Yet, even amid uncertainty, the ships carried the promise of discovery. Observations of cloud formations, wind patterns, and ocean color guided the crew. Instruments measured angles, shadows indicated latitude, and repeated readings validated earlier calculations. The Atlantic itself became a teacher, testing knowledge, intuition, and resilience. The monarchy's ambitions intertwined with science at every turn. Explorers were funded not as adventurers, but as empiricists, tasked with gathering knowledge, mapping coastlines, and assessing resources. They returned with logs that would inform future voyages, patterns of currents, behavior of trade winds, and the subtle influence of tides. Knowledge became the new treasure, with the potential to enrich nations as gold might. This alliance of curiosity, commerce, and science defined the age of exploration. By twilight, as ships maintained their courses under the stars, the horizon remained a canvas of uncertainty and promise. The sea demanded respect, but its challenges were met with instruments, intellect, and courage. Each wave, each gust of wind, each shifting shadow tested preparation and resolve. Through observation, careful measurement, and disciplined action, these explorers transformed a vast, mysterious ocean into a domain navigable by reason and human ingenuity. Nightfall brought both reflection and vigilance. The crew maintained watches, observing constellations and noting any signs of weather change. Stars were instruments of survival, shadows were guides, and the rhythm of the ocean dictated the pace of life. Celestial navigation merged with practical seamanship, demonstrating the power of knowledge applied at the edges of the known world. By dawn, every observation recorded, every adjustment made, contributed to a growing repository of expertise, a legacy that would guide future explorers across oceans yet uncharted. As the fleets left the safety of the harbor, the open ocean stretched endlessly before them, a canvas of both opportunity and peril. Waves rolled like mountains in the moonlight, reflecting silvery fragments of stars that guided the sailors. The wind, unpredictable yet constant, filled the sails and tested every seamstress's stitch and every carpenter's joinery. The ships, though meticulously prepared, seemed fragile against the immensity of the Atlantic. Yet human determination pressed forward, tempered by the knowledge gathered from maps, compasses, and generations of maritime observation. The first days were filled with routine and discipline. Sailors learned to read the subtle language of the sea, changes in watercolor that hinted at currents, shifts in bird flight that signaled nearby land, and the distant thunder of waves breaking against invisible reefs. Every observation was noted in logs with painstaking care, charts updated with lines that would someday guide future travelers. In this way, exploration was simultaneously an adventure and a scientific endeavor, blending courage with meticulous empirical documentation. Storms tested both man and machine. Lightning split the sky, thunder shook timbers, and waves slammed against the hull with tremendous force. Sailors lashed themselves to rails, climbed rigging with heart pounding, and adjusted sails to survive each onslaught. Yet even in these moments of fear, their instruments remained vital. Compasses were shielded from the turbulence. Astrolabes were used cautiously when clouds broke, and latitude calculations were taken whenever the stars peeked through gaps in the storm. Knowledge was their anchor, and experience their salvation. Each night, watch rotations ensured constant vigilance. The constellations were consulted as both clock and compass. Patterns in the heavens, once mythologized, became predictable instruments of navigation. Stars were not merely beautiful, they were the keys to survival. A single miscalculation could mean weeks lost, supplies wasted, or the loss of the entire expedition. Therefore, captains trained crews to harmonize human intuition with celestial science, forging a bond between the tangible and the theoretical that defined this new age of navigation. Amid the challenges, camaraderie grew. Sailors shared meals of salted meat and hard biscuits, exchanging tales of previous voyages and dreams of lands unseen. The monotony of the sea was punctuated by sudden bursts of laughter, the sighting of dolphins, or the distant cries of seabirds signaling proximity to life. These human moments were as vital as the instruments. Morale and mental fortitude determined whether knowledge could be applied effectively, and whether the journey would continue or end in despair. Meanwhile, captains and navigators continually consulted their charts. Currents were measured against drift, winds plotted against predicted paths, and deviations logged for future reference. Each correction was a lesson in applied physics, understanding resistance, leverage, and momentum. Ships rolled and pitched, but careful observation allowed adjustments that conserved energy and preserved both hull and crew. It was an intricate ballet, a balance of mathematics and instinct, executed daily on a moving stage. As the fleet pressed westward, the unknown became routine. Sailors identified patterns in clouds that indicated impending weather, recognized bird migrations as signs of continental proximity, and learned the subtle cues of ocean swells that revealed underwater topography. These insights were gathered without the modern convenience of sensors or satellites. Relying solely on eyes, instruments, and disciplined reasoning, the Atlantic transformed from an overwhelming mystery into a navigable domain where human intellect could wrest order from chaos. The cultural exchange between ports also shaped the voyages. Portuguese, Spanish, and Italian sailors shared techniques, from hull construction to sail rigging, from map notation to celestial calculation. Knowledge traveled faster than the ships themselves, merging into a collective intelligence that would define maritime exploration for decades. Innovations were rapidly tested. New sail designs improved speed, different hull shapes offered stability in storms, and refined compasses increased accuracy across latitude. Each adjustment, each improvement, was a step toward the mastery of the seas. As the horizon stretched, the dream of discovery took tangible form. Legends and superstitions were replaced by observation and calculation. Yet the thrill of possibility remained. Every morning brought the promise of new lands. Every sunset a reflection on challenges overcome. Explorers documented flora, fauna, and encounters with unknown peoples, adding empirical richness to the maps and expanding the European understanding of the world. The seas were no longer merely paths to trade, they became theaters of science, diplomacy, and cultural exchange. Innovations were rapidly tested. New sail designs improved speed, different hull shapes offered stability in storms, and refined compasses increased accuracy across latitude. Each adjustment, each improvement, was a step toward the mastery of the seas. And yet, despite preparation, despite science and discipline, the ocean demanded respect. Each day tested courage, intellect, and adaptability. The line between success and disaster was thin. A single storm could undo months of careful calculation. But for those who pressed onward, for those who trusted in charts, compasses, and the wisdom of predecessors, the Atlantic became not a void, but a canvas upon which human ambition and ingenuity could paint the first strokes of a truly global age. The fleet sailed on. Each league crossed a testament to observation, calculation, and daring. The marriage of courage, knowledge, and technology ensured that dreams of distant horizons were no longer mere fantasy. As the waves carried them further from familiar shores, the age of navigation asserted itself, proving that exploration was not only an act of bravery, but also a triumph of intellect over uncertainty. The morning air carried a tension unlike any other, thick with salt and anticipation. Sailors moved with precise urgency, eyes fixed on the horizon, hands steady on ropes and tillers, muscles taut from weeks of constant labor. Each wave's crest was measured, each gust of wind interpreted, and every subtle shift in the clouds noted. The ocean, once an infinite expanse of fear and myth, had become both a partner and an adversary. Its moods dictated the rhythm of life aboard the ships, forcing decisions that could mean survival or disaster. The men knew that beyond the visible water lay uncertainty, danger, and promise. Each league crossed was a step into a world that existed more in imagination than in maps. Fear was ever present, yet it was tempered by discipline, skill, and the necessity of perseverance. Captains convened quietly on the quarterdeck, compasses and astrolabes in hand. Charts were spread, lines traced with calloused fingers, predictions of wind and current debated. Despite meticulous preparation, the vastness of the Atlantic rendered certainty impossible. The science of navigation was as much intuition as calculation, requiring both knowledge and experience. Each decision carried consequences that would ripple through the crew, the fleet, and the voyage itself. Every sailor carried both excitement and fear, aware that the success of the expedition depended not just on skill, but on endurance, judgment, and the mercy of the elements. By midday, a thin veil of mist enveloped the fleet, blurring the horizon and muting the Sunday visibility, dropped to a few dozen paces, forcing vigilance to its peak. Sailors called out distances, adjusted sails, and scanned the waters for subtle clues: the direction of waves, the pattern of floating debris, and the distant flight of seabirds. These were not idle observations. They were the language of the sea, a system of signs and symbols that had to be read correctly or disaster would follow. Every observation was a small experiment in applied physics, a chance to test knowledge of currents, drag, lift, and the interplay of wind against sails and hull. Below deck, the rhythm of labor continued, a constant hum of coordinated motion. Stores of water and provisions were carefully rationed. Barrels rolled with each swell, testing the sailors' endurance. Men worked to keep the hulls balanced, to prevent unnecessary wear, and to maintain the delicate equilibrium between ship and sea. The monotony of the voyage, punctuated by the sporadic terror of rough seas and unexpected squalls, forged a camaraderie born of shared risk. Every shared task, every coordinated effort, reinforced the fragile balance between survival and progress. The crew began to understand that the ocean was not merely a passage, but a demanding teacher. Nightfall brought a different challenge. Darkness transformed familiar waves into vast, shifting shadows. Stars emerged, faint at first, then increasingly bright, revealing constellations that were both guides and guardians. Navigators consulted astrolabes and early quadrants, measuring angles to determine latitude. Each calculation carried the weight of life and death. for a single misreading could lead the fleet astray, into reefs, shoals, or open seas where no rescue awaited. The constellations became maps, the celestial bodies an unerring compass. Sailors spoke quietly of the North Star, of Orion's belt, and of the Southern Cross, weaving legend and observation into practical navigation. Yet for all the hardships, moments of awe reminded the sailors of the purpose of their endeavor. Bioluminescent waves traced the hulls, turning the ocean into a galaxy of liquid light. Dolphins leaped along the bow, unafraid, as if endorsing their passage. The wind's song through the rigging became almost musical, a signal of motion and progress. Even amid fear and uncertainty, wonder reinforced determination, binding the men to a mission greater than themselves. They had come to defy distance, to extend human reach across the unimaginable vastness of the sea. And in those small, magical moments, the ocean seemed almost to approve. Conflicts arose, of course. Disagreements over navigation, tension from cramped quarters, fatigue, and the psychological strain of isolation threatened morale. But captains and officers exercised authority with both discipline and persuasion, reminding their men of the stakes, the rewards, and the legacy of exploration. Discipline became as crucial as courage. Without it, chaos could undo months of meticulous planning. Each order, each correction, reinforced the delicate interplay of leadership, knowledge, and resilience that defined the era of oceanic discovery. The men learned that survival depended as much on obedience and precision as it did on bravery. Currents began to show patterns. Water temperature, color, and debris provided clues to the path of the Atlantic gyre. Sailors learned to anticipate changes, adjusting sails to catch favorable winds while avoiding hidden dangers. Each adjustment was a practical application of physics. Momentum, drag, lift, and resistance all played roles in the movement of these wooden vessels. The sea became a laboratory where theory and practice merged seamlessly, creating expertise that could be passed to future generations. Instruments were tested, recalibrated, and sometimes improvised from scraps. The lessons of the voyage would inform countless explorers who followed. Weeks turned into months, and the men endured storms that raged for days, threatening to undo all progress. Sails tore, masts groaned, and waves crashed over decks with relentless force. The sound of splintering wood and snapping ropes was constant, a grim reminder of the ocean's dominance. Yet they pressed on, each sailor relying on the other, each captain reading the signs with increasing precision. Adaptation became instinct. Experience became memory encoded into every action. The ships became extensions of their crews, vessels of both survival and discovery. And then, one morning, a whisper of excitement spread through the fleet. Land had been sighted. At first, it was only a faint shadow on the horizon, a dark smudge against the sky. Then details sharpened, shapes of cliffs, glimmers of sand, and the rise of trees. The unknown was now tangible. The sailors' hearts raced with exhilaration, relief, and anticipation. Landfall was more than survival. It was proof that human ambition, combined with careful observation and skill, could overcome the immense uncertainty of the ocean. The Atlantic, which had seemed infinite and insurmountable, had yielded its secret. Approaching the shore, boats were prepared to scout inlets and rivers. The captains weighed risks carefully, understanding tides, shoals, and currents. The first contact with this new land was deliberate, a mixture of curiosity, caution, and strategic calculation. Each footstep onto the soil was documented, observations recorded, and sketches made. Flora, fauna, and natural resources were noted for potential future voyages. The land was both discovery and a new set of equations to solve its challenges and rewards, now intertwined with human understanding. Every tree, river, and stone became part of a mental map, ready to guide future explorers further inland and across oceans, yet uncharted. Even as they set anchors and explored, the sailors knew their journey was not complete. The ocean remained vast behind them, and other dangers awaited in uncharted waters. Yet in this moment, achievement overshadowed anxiety. The horizon had been crossed, the unknown confronted, and human ingenuity affirmed. The marriage of courage, science, and navigation had turned legend into reality, proving that the age of exploration was not merely about adventure, but about the disciplined application of knowledge to conquer the formidable mysteries of the natural world. Their success was a testament to observation, calculation, endurance, and the unyielding human desire to expand the boundaries of experience. The first contact with land did not bring immediate relief. The horizon, once endless and daunting, now presented new uncertainties. The coastline was unfamiliar, jagged with rocky outcrops and hidden shoals. Waves crashed against unseen reefs, threatening the fragile wooden hulls. Sailors scanned the shore with wary eyes, noting every detail of the beach, the slope, the presence of wildlife, and the potential for anchorage. Each observation was an exercise in anticipation, the practical application of knowledge accumulated over weeks and months at sea. The ocean had been an adversary. Now, the land presented its own challenges, a new frontier demanding respect and careful calculation. The fleet slowed, tacking against wind and tide to approach the safest entry points. Captains conferred, comparing notes, consulting instruments, and observing currents. Astrolabes were used to confirm latitude, compasses aligned to check orientation, and charts were updated with tentative sketches. Every decision was a negotiation with the elements wind, current, tide, and the shape of the shoreline. Miscalculation could strand ships on hidden reefs or scatter the fleet into chaos. The men moved with disciplined urgency, aware that even the smallest error could turn triumph into catastrophe. Landing parties prepared, lowering longboats into the water with careful precision. Sailors descended cautiously, oars cutting through brackish surf, boots sinking into sand or mud. Each step was measured, a delicate balance between curiosity and caution. Observations were recorded, from the color of the water to the scent of the soil and the behavior of birds overhead. Everything mattered. Every environmental clue could indicate hidden dangers, safe passages, or suitable locations for replenishment. The first footprints left on this shore were small but significant, traces of human presence in a world previously unknown. As they explored, interactions with the land's ecology became critical. Freshwater sources were sought, edible plants identified, and hazards avoided. The sailors' knowledge of natural physics, chemistry, and biology was applied instinctively. Water density, tides, and currents were monitored, noting the changes that could affect both navigation and anchorage. Soil composition was analyzed to assess the risk of bogs or unstable ground. Rocks and cliffs were measured for potential danger or advantage, whether for defense, visibility, or establishing a temporary camp. In each assessment, applied science intersected with survival instinct. The mood among the crew shifted gradually. Excitement blended with awe, relief, and an undercurrent of fatigue. The journey had tested endurance, skill, and courage, but the sight of land validated months of planning and perseverance. Conversations buzzed quietly, often about the technical challenges overcome, predicting the path of currents, adjusting sails to catch optimal wind, maintaining equilibrium on rolling decks, and interpreting celestial navigation. The men recognized that their success was as much a triumph of intellect and observation as it was of endurance and bravery. Officers gathered data meticulously. They sketched the shoreline, noting angles and distances, tides and vegetation. Measurements were taken using basic tools, compasses aligned, and rudimentary surveying applied to estimate scale and distance. These notes would inform future voyages, allowing subsequent expeditions to improve efficiency, safety, and knowledge. The sketches were not mere records. They were instruments of learning, translating observation into actionable intelligence. Each mark on parchment represented hours of calculation, experimentation, and deduction. The tension of the unknown persisted. Every forested edge might conceal hazards. Every river mouth could be treacherous. They moved deliberately, exploring cautiously yet systematically. Some sailors ventured farther inland, mapping the terrain, noting elevation changes, and identifying potential hazards. Observations of flora and fauna were cataloged, assessing edible resources, water quality, and risks of predation. Each detail was weighed, processed, and cross-referenced against prior knowledge and experience. The men were not merely explorers, they were scientists, engineers, and strategists in a theater dictated by nature. Nightfall brought another trial. The stars rose as silent guides, the same constellations that had led them across vast, featureless oceans. Celestial navigation continued to serve as a critical checkpoint, ensuring orientation and confirming positions relative to known latitudes. The sounds of the new land, rustling leaves, nocturnal animals, and distant waves interwove with the natural rhythm of wind and tide. Sleep was sparse. Watches were maintained rigorously to respond to any sudden threat or opportunity. The crew had learned that vigilance, even at rest, was essential to survival in uncharted territories. As days passed, routines formed. Observations of the tide and wind, monitoring of supplies, and maintenance of the ships and equipment became ingrained. Lessons learned on the open ocean were now applied to the complexities of the shore. Anchors were tested against tides, ropes adjusted to prevent chafing, and provisions managed carefully to avoid spoilage. Small innovations emerged: improvised pulleys, temporary bridges, and protective barriers demonstrating the adaptive ingenuity necessary for exploration. Knowledge accumulated rapidly, each success building confidence, each failure instructing caution. Interactions among the crew reflected human psychology under stress. Leadership, morale, and social cohesion were as critical as navigation or engineering skill. Captains reinforced discipline, officers motivated sailors, and small rituals or shared stories preserved morale. Every decision carried both tactical and emotional weight. Crew cohesion became an invisible force, stabilizing operations amidst the uncertainty of an unfamiliar environment. The discipline and camaraderie forged at sea were now tested on land, proving indispensable to the mission's continuation. Ultimately, the arrival at land was a synthesis of science, skill, and human resolve. Navigation instruments, applied physics, knowledge of winds and currents, and disciplined teamwork converged to achieve what mere courage alone could not. The crossing of the Atlantic had transformed imagination into reality, myth into cartography, and speculation into empirical observation. Each sailor's effort, each calculation, each adjustment of sail and rudder contributed to a monumental achievement: the first successful navigation from the known world into the uncharted. The land itself, once perceived as an insurmountable boundary, now existed within human understanding, mapped, measured, and recorded. It was not merely discovery, it was the codification of knowledge into actionable intelligence. Every tree, stream, and rock became part of a growing network of understanding that would guide future generations. The first explorers had not only bridged oceans but also bridged the gap between imagination and empirical reality. In reflection, the journey illustrated the intimate connection between human ingenuity and the natural world. The success of the voyage rested on observation, applied science, endurance, and collaboration. It was a testament to the capacity of disciplined human effort to extend the limits of experience and understanding. As the fleet prepared for the next stage, the sailors knew they had rewritten the possibilities of exploration, setting the stage for an era in which oceans could be crossed, continents understood, and the unknown progressively revealed. The Atlantic had been a teacher, a challenge, and ultimately a canvas upon which human skill and courage painted the first strokes of global knowledge. The sea was no longer merely a backdrop. It had become a living, breathing laboratory. Every wave, every gust of wind, every shift in current presented both opportunity and peril. Sailors now understood that the ocean was a dynamic system, a vast network of interacting forces that could be studied, anticipated, and, when mastered, leveraged. The science of navigation was evolving rapidly, driven by necessity as much as curiosity. Astrolabes, sextants, and rudimentary crossstaffs became essential tools. Through careful observation, sailors could measure the altitude of the sun or stars above the horizon, translating angles into latitude with a surprising degree of accuracy. The calculations were painstaking, yet precise. Men squinted against the glare, marking the position of celestial bodies, noting the time of measurement, and cross-referencing their readings with charts painstakingly copied or drawn at sea. The heavens themselves were transformed into instruments, each constellation a landmark, each movement a guide across the endless expanse of water. Wind and current were studied with equal rigor. Sailors recorded patterns, noting the direction, strength, and variability of prevailing winds. Trade winds became predictable allies, and knowledge of monsoon patterns in southern waters allowed for efficient planning of long voyages. Currents were measured through observation and experimentation. Floating objects tracked across hours, depth sampled with weighted lines, tides estimated by the behavior of coastal markers. The ocean revealed its rhythms to those willing to pay attention, and every piece of knowledge gained could mean the difference between survival and disaster. The physics of the sea demanded practical application. Buoyancy, resistance, and the mechanics of sails were constantly considered. How a vessel responded to wind pressure, the effect of wave height on stability, the torque exerted by the rudder, these were not abstract concepts, but daily concerns. Sailors adjusted their rigging, shifting sail angles, lowering masts, and balancing cargo to optimize performance. Theories of fluid dynamics existed only in observation, yet through trial and error, crews developed an intuitive understanding of lift, drag, and momentum that allowed their ships to traverse great distances safely. Observation extended beyond mechanics. Weather patterns became critical data points. Darkening clouds, sudden shifts in wind direction, or the smell of rain in the air could indicate storms ahead. Sailors learned to read the color of the sea and the flight of birds as indicators of land or changes in weather. Clouds, lightning, and barometric changes, though not fully understood scientifically, were cataloged, giving the crew early warning and allowing navigators to adjust their course before disaster struck. Nature had become a partner, an instructor, and sometimes a formidable adversary. Instruments required constant calibration. Compass needles, delicate and sensitive, were affected by nearby iron and the ship's own movement. Corrections had to be made, often through repeated observation of the sun or a fixed star. Charts were continually refined, based on experience and comparison with celestial readings. This interplay of observation, measurement, and correction created a feedback loop, a proto-scientific method applied in the chaotic environment of the open ocean. Every adjustment improved accuracy and confidence in navigation. The human element was equally critical. Sailors were trained in both technique and theory, expected to understand the principles behind the tools they wielded. Captains relied not only on instruments but on instinct honed through experience. Judgments about currents, tides, and wind shifts required combining empirical observation with intuition. Knowledge was communal. Lessons learned on one voyage informed the next. Errors were noted meticulously, allowing subsequent expeditions to avoid past miscalculations. The accumulation of data, empirical and anecdotal, formed the foundation of a new era in maritime science. Night at sea was a different kind of classroom. The stars became even more vital, their positions carefully logged, cross-referenced, and memorized. Sailors navigated by patterns in the heavens, noting the rise and set of constellations to determine direction. Shadows of clouds on the water and the reflection of the moon offered subtle cues about wind and wave conditions. Celestial observation was intertwined with practical seamanship, demonstrating an elegant marriage of physics, astronomy, and experience. Understanding the sea also meant understanding risk. Currents could accelerate a ship dangerously close to hidden reefs. Sudden squalls could capsize unprepared vessels. Navigators learned to anticipate changes, to read subtle signs, to adjust sails and course in advance. Calculations were made with approximate formulas, but each assumption carried weighty consequences. The ocean demanded respect. Mastery was temporary, contingent on continuous observation and responsiveness. Experiments in real time occurred daily. Anchoring techniques, hull adjustments, sail modifications, and ballast distribution were all tested and refined. Minor innovations, a shifted rudder, a modified sail, or a better-kept log of currents could improve efficiency dramatically. Science was applied at every turn, sometimes imperceptibly, sometimes in the form of critical life-saving decisions. Each observation, correction, and adjustment was recorded mentally or on parchment, contributing to a growing body of maritime knowledge that would guide future explorers. The interplay of mathematics and navigation was subtle but ever present. Distance covered in a day required constant estimation, speed over water measured with knots, time carefully tracked with rudimentary hourglasses, drift calculated by integrating wind and current. These measures informed course adjustments and future projections. The sailor became both mathematician and experimenter, translating observation into actionable navigation strategy. Morale and psychology intertwined with science. Confidence in instruments and methods reinforced discipline, encouraged careful observation, and reduced panic in the face of storms. Crew cohesion allowed for systematic data collection, efficient sail management, and effective problem solving. The human mind, disciplined by both training and necessity, became as crucial as the finest astrolabe or compass. By the end of the first month at sea, a new understanding of the Atlantic had emerged. Sailors possessed not only records of wind and current, but also an intuitive grasp of oceanic systems, patterns of waves, influence of lunar cycles on tides, and prevailing weather conditions. Each voyage layered new knowledge onto old, slowly transforming myth and conjecture into empirical understanding. The ocean was no longer merely a threat. It was a complex system that could be studied, anticipated, and navigated with increasing reliability. The mastery of observation, measurement, and applied physics created a new reality for exploration. Ships no longer drifted aimlessly. They were guided with precision, informed by knowledge, skill, and intuition. Sailors had begun to harness the forces of nature, turning them into allies rather than threats. This foundation of applied science would enable the next stage of global exploration, transforming human ambition into actionable reality and bridging the gap between imagination and discovery. The second half of the journey across the open ocean demanded an even greater intimacy with the sea than the explorers had ever known. Every day, every hour, the rhythm of waves against the hull, the subtle tug of the current, and the ceaseless play of wind on the sails became a language, one that had to be understood or the voyage would fail. Patterns that had been observed, noted, and theorized in the relative safety of coastal waters were now tested relentlessly across thousands of miles of uncharted expanse. A slight miscalculation in the strength or direction of the wind could send a vessel hundreds of miles off course, while underestimating the pull of an unseen current might carry it into dangerous shoals or deeper, untracked waters. Currents were invisible to the eye, yet undeniable in their effect, a silent force that could either hasten the journey or frustrate it entirely. Sailors learned to feel these currents in the vessel's motion, subtle differences in speed, the shifting resistance against the rudder, and even the way debris or floating vegetation passed alongside the hull. Each observation was meticulously recorded in the navigator's mind, cross-referenced with prior experiences, and incorporated into decisions that could mean survival or disaster. These insights, though empirical, were a form of science in its rawest sense, a practical understanding of nature tested by repetition, consequence, and observation. Storms, the ever-present threat of the Atlantic, arrived without warning, sometimes brewing slowly on the horizon, at other times bursting forth from calm seas with little notice. Clouds darkened and swirled, waves rose with a terrifying grandeur, and winds howled with a force that seemed almost sentient, testing the resilience of both vessel and crew. Yet there were subtle signs, signals from the sky and sea that could be interpreted by the trained eye. The smell of the air, the shape and movement of clouds, and even the behavior of seabirds offered clues about the imminence and direction of storms. These natural warnings allowed captains and crews to prepare, adjusting sails, securing rigging, and redistributing ballast to ensure maximum stability. Measurement remained the lifeline for survival and progress. Simple instruments like the hourglass and the log line were essential tools for estimating the vessel's speed and distance traveled. These rudimentary devices, combined with celestial observations, allowed navigators to construct mental maps of vast stretches of water. Each reading from an astrolabe or sextant, every calculation of latitude, required meticulous attention. Errors of even a few degrees could mean missing land entirely, running aground on unseen shoals, or drifting into hostile or unknown waters. The navigator's craft was a combination of precise calculation and intuition, honed through experience and art balanced on the edge of survival. The relationship between wind, sail, and ship design became an intimate science. Mariners understood that the triangular sails of a caravel allowed for tacking against the wind, offering both agility and resilience in unpredictable conditions. By observing the wind's angle, strength, and direction, they could adjust the sails to capture its power most efficiently, converting chaotic energy into forward momentum. Ship stability depended not only on design, but also on careful manipulation of ballast and cargo, as even minor miscalculations could compromise the hull's balance in heavy seas. The crew worked in concert, each member attuned to the motion of the ship, the flapping of sails, and the subtle cues that told them whether the vessel was leaning into danger or gliding safely across the waves. At night, the heavens became the guiding canvas. Without modern chronometers, precise timekeeping was impossible, yet the stars offered constant reference points. Navigators measured the height of constellations above the horizon, plotted the positions of known stars, and used their movement to estimate latitude. The moon's phases, the glow of distant celestial bodies, and even the faint reflection of starlight on the waves became part of the navigational toolkit. Mental mapping of the ocean required a synthesis of these observations with previous knowledge of currents, winds, and the ship's performance under different conditions. The process was iterative. Observation led to calculation, which informed action, which in turn provided new observations to refine understanding. Seasonal variations in wind and current were critical. Mariners noted how trade winds shifted, how monsoon patterns altered predictable routes, and how changes in temperature affected both the air and water currents. Detailed knowledge of these cycles became essential for planning departure dates, anticipating storm seasons, and maximizing speed. Even the slightest deviation from expected patterns could prolong voyages dangerously, threatening food supplies, morale, and the very survival of the crew. By carefully charting these cycles, explorers were able to plan with a growing confidence, transforming the ocean from a capricious adversary into a measurable, navigable environment. Risk management was intertwined with the science of navigation. Decisions about sail configuration, course corrections, and crew assignments were all based on empirical observation and calculated judgment. A misstep, a misread instrument, or a misjudged current could be fatal. Yet every voyage was also a learning opportunity. Adjustments made in response to changing conditions improved the collective knowledge of the crew and future expeditions alike. Success and failure were inseparable teachers, shaping the evolving discipline of maritime exploration. The natural world itself provided a guide. Birds, fish, and the behavior of water often indicated proximity to land or shallow reefs. The color of the water, temperature changes, and even the way waves broke against submerged obstacles offered subtle warnings. The attentive sailor learned to read these signs intuitively, integrating them with instrument readings and historical knowledge. Nature was not merely an environment to survive, it was a partner, providing insights that could not be derived from calculation alone. The process of navigating the vast ocean had evolved into a blend of art and science. The crew's mastery over wind, current, and celestial mechanics allowed them to transform uncertainty into opportunity. Sailing became a synthesis of experience, empirical observation, and instinctive judgment. Every adjustment of sail, every course correction, every observation of the sky or the water reflected accumulated knowledge passed down from previous voyages, refined through practice, and tested in real time. By the conclusion of this stage, explorers had developed a profound understanding of the Atlantic. The sea, once a mysterious expanse fraught with legends and fear, had been measured, plotted, and partially tamed. They understood the physical forces at play, the patterns of currents and wind, and the subtleties of celestial navigation. They had learned to anticipate danger, to harness the elements, and to interpret the hidden signs of the natural world. In essence, they had transformed the unpredictable Atlantic into a domain that could be understood, studied, and eventually crossed with confidence. With these lessons mastered, the stage was set for the next great steps in exploration. The knowledge of currents, winds, celestial positions, and ship mechanics provided the foundation for crossing vast oceans, discovering unknown lands, and connecting continents. Science, observation, and human courage had merged, creating a blueprint that would enable the age of discovery to unfold. The lessons learned on this treacherous stretch of ocean would echo through subsequent expeditions, informing every chart, instrument, and navigational strategy that explorers would rely upon in the centuries to come. The moment land emerged on the horizon, the ocean's vast anonymity transformed into a frame of reference, a tangible space that could be charted and claimed. For centuries, the seas had been places of mystery, myth, and speculation, boundless blue expanses where currents and storms dictated the rhythm of human endeavor. Now, with the discoveries of the Atlantic crossings, these expanses became measurable, navigable, and crucially, politically significant. The first glimpses of the Americas, the Caribbean archipelagos, and the coasts of Africa were not merely geographic revelations, they were windows into a world that would be contested, mapped, and eventually governed by empires. Cartographers, once working in relative abstraction, suddenly found themselves at the center of a global transformation. Portolan charts, once confined to familiar coastlines and trading routes, had to be expanded, reoriented, and corrected. The juxtaposition of old knowledge with new sightings challenged every assumption. How far did the Atlantic truly stretch? Where did the continents lie in relation to one another? The placement of each coastline, each river mouth, each inlet carried both economic and political weight. Maps became more than guides. They were statements of claim, tools of negotiation, and instruments of power. The work of mapping the New World was meticulous and demanding. Explorers returned with observations that were simultaneously empirical and subjective, colored by the limitations of their instruments, the fallibility of memory, and the chaos of storms. The length of a day at sea was measured in the subtle roll of the ship, the timing of the sun's passage across the horizon, and the shifting patterns of stars. Latitude could be estimated, but longitude remained a stubbornly elusive quantity. Every sketch, every note, every mark on parchment represented a careful synthesis of observation, calculation, and inference. Errors, even minor, could mislead future expeditions, leading ships onto reefs or into unknown dangers. Yet, each new voyage refined the collective understanding, gradually transforming speculation into precision. The psychological weight on the navigators and mapmakers was immense. These men were intermediaries between the unknown and the known, tasked with converting the chaotic ocean and alien coastlines into symbols and lines on paper. Their charts guided kings, merchants, and captains alike, influencing decisions that could lead to fortune or disaster. In the flickering light of candlelit rooms, with maps spread across wooden tables, compasses and dividers in hand, these artisans of knowledge reconciled contradictory accounts, smoothed jagged lines of uncertainty, and wove together fragments of experience into coherent representations of the world. Political implications followed swiftly. Monarchs understood that accurate maps were as vital as armed fleets. Territorial claims depended not just on discovery but on documentation, on the ability to demonstrate control, to show a presence in regions previously unknown to Europeans. Disputes erupted over islands, bays, and river mouths, often long before settlements were established. Knowledge itself became a weapon, a currency of power as valuable as gold or cannons. The work of mapping the New World was meticulous and demanding. Explorers returned with observations that were simultaneously empirical and subjective, colored by the limitations of their instruments, the fallibility of memory, and the chaos of storms. The length of a day at sea was measured in the subtle roll of the ship, the timing of the sun's passage across the horizon, and the shifting patterns of stars. Latitude could be estimated, but longitude remained a stubbornly elusive quantity. Merchants, too, were quick to grasp the significance. Trade routes that had been dictated by prevailing winds and currents could now be planned with greater accuracy. The position of harbors, the direction of currents, and the strength of prevailing winds could be incorporated into schedules, inventories, and strategies for maximizing profit. Maps became predictive tools, allowing for the anticipation of seasonal shifts and the timing of voyages to align with both commercial and political objectives. Knowledge of geography, once the province of explorers and scholars, became essential to commerce. The encounter with the New World challenged European imagination as well as technical knowledge. Vast forests, unfamiliar flora and fauna, and new celestial perspectives forced a reconsideration of natural history and cosmology. Indigenous cultures, with their own understanding of the land and sea, introduced new layers of knowledge that had to be interpreted, appropriated, or misunderstood. Explorers took note of river courses, mountain ranges, and tidal patterns, often overlaying them onto their own preconceptions. The act of mapping was as much a cultural exercise as a scientific one, blending empirical observation with assumptions, myth, and expectation. The refinement of cartography accelerated as navigational instruments improved. The sextant, the cross-staff, and the astrolabe provided more precise readings of latitude. Observations of lunar phases, star positions, and solar declination allowed for more accurate calculations of distance and orientation. Each return voyage contributed to a cumulative understanding, slowly correcting the distortions and exaggerations that had persisted in earlier maps. By correlating multiple sources of dataship logs, celestial measurements, coastal sketches, mapmakers began to approximate a truer representation of the world. Yet, the process was iterative, never perfect. Every voyage revealed inconsistencies, anomalies, and surprises. Islands were misidentified, coastlines misrepresented, and vast stretches of ocean remained ambiguous. The maps of one decade could be outdated by discoveries in the next, but the accumulation of knowledge was relentless. Each correction, each new chart, was a step toward a comprehensive understanding of the globe. The tension between known and unknown, certainty and speculation, drove innovation and intellectual ambition alike. As Europe's knowledge expanded, so too did its ambitions. Maps shaped policy, dictated military strategy, and influenced colonial endeavors. Fortifications were planned in new territories based on coastal surveys, while supply routes were optimized through an understanding of prevailing currents and wind patterns. Exploration became inseparable from empire building, and the science of the sea became the foundation upon which political and economic power was projected. The act of drawing a coastline was simultaneously an act of imagination, calculation, and assertion of authority. By the end of this phase, the world had been redrawn in European eyes. The oceans, once inscrutable and terrifying, were now part of a comprehensible network. Landmasses previously unknown or mythologized had been located, roughly measured, and represented. The balance of knowledge and imagination allowed for new strategies, trade, and exploration. What had been uncertainty had become opportunity, and what had been fear had been transformed into a navigable, exploitable expanse. The consequences of these newly drawn maps reached far beyond geography. They reshaped economies, altered political alliances, and shifted cultural paradigms. Knowledge of the world's dimensions and resources changed the very way societies conceived of themselves and their place in the cosmos. The act of mapping the New World was not merely a technical achievement. It was an intellectual revolution, one that reverberated through centuries, influencing science, commerce, and geopolitics alike. As Europe's knowledge expanded, so too did its ambitions. Maps shaped policy, dictated military strategy, and influenced colonial endeavors. Fortifications were planned in new territories based on coastal surveys, while supply routes were optimized through an understanding of prevailing currents and wind patterns. Exploration became inseparable from empire building, and the science of the sea became the foundation upon which political and economic power was projected. The tension between known and unknown, certainty and speculation, drove innovation and intellectual ambition alike. The charts that emerged from these voyages were more than tools, they were symbols of human ambition and ingenuity. They captured both the triumphs and limitations of exploration, reflecting the delicate interplay of observation, calculation, intuition, and risk. They were living documents, continually revised, contested, and refined. Each line and curve a testament to the labor, skill, and daring of those who had ventured into the unknown. What had once been speculation, the location of a reef, the course of a river, the presence of an inlet, was gradually verified or corrected through successive voyages. Each correction was a testament to the painstaking accumulation of knowledge, a delicate balance of observation, deduction, and cross-referencing. Merchants, eager to capitalize on newly discovered lands, paid close attention. Port cities flourished as they became nodes connecting Europe to the distant Americas, Africa, and Asia. The mapping of coastlines and harbors was no longer purely academic. It dictated the flow of goods, the positioning of warehouses, and the timing of convoys. A well-charted port meant safer landings, predictable resupply, and ultimately increased profits. Cartography was commercial power as much as it was scientific achievement. Knowledge of tides, currents, and prevailing winds informed the design of shipping routes that could save weeks of travel, avoid storms, or circumvent hostile territories. The social impact of these maps was profound. Once the New World's existence became widely acknowledged, Europe's collective imagination shifted. Tales of gold, fertile lands, and exotic species circulated, inspiring curiosity and ambition in equal measure. Prints and engravings of maps were displayed in courts and universities, bridging the gap between exploration and scholarship. These visual representations of the world transformed perception. The Atlantic was no longer an unknowable expanse, but a measurable space, a stage upon which commerce, conquest, and diplomacy played out. Politically, maps became instruments of negotiation and assertion. Treaties and charters relied heavily on accurate geographic knowledge. Monarchs leveraged the authority of cartographers to legitimize territorial claims. When two kingdoms disputed an island or a stretch of coastline, the map was as decisive as an army. The delineation of boundaries based on new discoveries set the stage for centuries of colonial expansion and conflict. Accurate depiction of resources, harbors, and navigable rivers determined where forts would be built, where fleets would anchor, and where settlements would be founded. For the navigators themselves, the process was both exhilarating and perilous. The seas they charted were still unpredictable. Storms could erase weeks of progress, and the limits of instruments made precision an ongoing challenge. Yet, with each journey, confidence grew. Navigators developed methods for cross-checking latitude and longitude, using celestial observations, dead reckoning, and careful log-keeping. They learned to interpret subtle signs, changes in watercolor, the flight patterns of birds, cloud formations to anticipate landfall. Knowledge was iterative. Experience became codified into rules, techniques, and conventions that future generations would inherit. The refinement of charts transformed strategy. Naval commanders could plan voyages with unprecedented certainty. Supply lines could be calculated with precision. Convoys could be timed to exploit favorable winds. Fleets could anticipate enemy movements and position themselves advantageously. The seas had become arenas where intellect and preparation could outweigh brute force. No longer was a sailor entirely at the mercy of chance. Skill, knowledge, and foresight became decisive factors. At the same time, the interaction with the New World forced Europeans to confront different systems of knowledge. Indigenous navigation, local environmental understanding, and survival strategies offered insights that were incorporated, sometimes selectively or incompletely, into European maps. Rivers were traced, coastlines measured, and local knowledge recorded. This exchange was not always equitable, but it contributed to a growing awareness that empirical observation, careful recording, and collaboration were as valuable as conquest. The consolidation of discoveries also accelerated technological innovation. Improved astrolabes, cross-staffs, and later sextants allowed for more accurate celestial navigation. Compasses were refined with better needles, cases, and graduations. Charts were printed and disseminated more widely, standardizing knowledge and making it accessible to navigators who had not personally undertaken the voyages. The interplay between observation, technology, and dissemination of information created a feedback loop that fueled further exploration. Culturally, the expanding world reshaped art, literature, and philosophy. Maps began to appear in atlases, accompanied by narratives of voyages, encounters with strange lands, and accounts of flora and fauna. The visualization of distant continents inspired new genres of writing, fostering a sense of shared global consciousness. Scholars debated the accuracy of reports, astronomers cross-referenced observations, and artists translated geographic knowledge into visual form, bridging science and culture. By the time the New World's contours were reasonably understood, Europe had entered a new era, Oceans were no longer barriers, they were connectors. Trade routes became highways of information and commodities. Knowledge of geography translated directly into power, influence, and wealth. The act of mapping, once a scholarly pursuit, had become central to the ambitions of kings, merchants, and explorers. Precision, observation, and intellectual rigor became as critical as courage, seamanship, or martial skill. The legacy of this era of mapping extended beyond immediate political and economic implications. It laid the groundwork for modern geography, navigation, and oceanography. The principles of measurement, observation, and documentation established by these early cartographers became the foundation for scientific inquiry. Each coastline traced, each island recorded, each current noted, contributed to a cumulative understanding that continues to inform our comprehension of the world today. The world, once vast, uncertain, and myth-laden, had been drawn into human comprehension. The edges of maps no longer ended in "here be dragons." They extended into oceans of knowledge, curiosity, and human aspiration. Maps had transformed perception into action, imagination into strategy, and observation into power. They were the instruments through which humanity could not just survive the seas but master them. In the quiet moments aboard returning ships, when the sails were furled and the ink still drying on new charts, explorers and cartographers alike understood the significance of their work. They were not merely chroniclers, they were architects of a new world, delineating possibilities, connecting continents, and redefining the limits of human ambition. Their charts were more than paper and ink. They were blueprints of a future yet to be realized. And so, the world was redrawn, not through conquest alone, nor by mere chance, but through careful observation, calculation, and the courage to venture beyond the familiar. The maps of this era captured not just geography, but the unfolding story of human ingenuity, ambition, and discovery, a story that would guide generations to come across oceans, continents, and the uncharted frontiers of knowledge. The horizon stretched endlessly, a vast canvas of blue and gray, and it had always been a promise to the bold, the curious, and the daring. For centuries, men had stared out into that void, where the ocean met the sky, and dared to imagine a world beyond the familiar coastline. The tools they carried, first crude compasses, rough maps, and simple astrolabes, were mere extensions of human imagination, bridging the distance between the known and the unknown. The seas had long been feared, their depths and storms the subject of superstition, myth, and awe. But slowly, painstakingly, human observation began to unveil their patterns. Waves and currents, winds and stars, were no longer capricious enemies, they became guides, allies in a game that spanned continents. Early navigators had transformed their fear into knowledge, keeping journals filled with minute details about currents, tides, seasonal winds, and celestial alignments. These were not just personal records, they were the building blocks of a collective understanding, passed from ship to ship, port to port, generation to generation. In the quiet moments between storms, sailors studied the behavior of gulls and whales, noting the direction of their flight or migration, correlating it with the locations of distant landmasses. Every observation, every minor correction in course, became a lesson in applied science. The ocean itself, a living laboratory where theory met experience. The compass, that small iron needle suspended in a fluid-filled housing, had become a symbol of certainty in an uncertain world. Its introduction to European navigation was revolutionary, turning instinctive guesswork into a disciplined, repeatable methodology. Mariners learned to read not only the needle but the subtle shifts of the magnetic field, compensating for deviation and local anomalies. In tandem, cartographers produced increasingly sophisticated portolan charts, capturing coastlines, inlets, and hazards with precision that bordered on artistry. Maps were no longer mere representations. They were instruments, tools of planning and projection, capable of shaping empires. Ships evolved alongside navigation, their design reflecting lessons learned from countless crossings. The caravel, nimble yet durable, with its triangular lateen sails, harnessed wind with unprecedented efficiency. Hulls were reinforced to withstand storms, rudders refined to allow for precise maneuvering, and every element from the mast to the keel reflected centuries of empirical observation. These vessels were laboratories, theaters, and workshops all at once, floating embodiments of human ingenuity, courage, and meticulous attention to detail. On board, crews recorded weather patterns, experimented with sail configurations, and shared insights that would ripple across generations. The power of these technological advancements extended far beyond navigation itself. Nations that mastered the seas gained the ability to project influence, establish trade routes, and build empires. Portugal and Spain understood the strategic advantage of maritime knowledge, and their fleets became instruments of power. Wealth flowed along ocean highways, bringing gold, spices, textiles, and knowledge to Europe. These voyages redefined diplomacy and warfare. Control of the seas equated to control of resources, commerce, and information. In a very real sense, the compass and the map were as potent as armies and cannons, shaping the destiny of nations before a single shot was fired. But beyond the practical, there was wonder. The ocean, vast and merciless, offered moments of sublime beauty. The way sunlight fractured across waves, the phosphorescent glow of plankton at night, the elegant arc of a gull tracing the wind. These details inspired stories, songs, and illustrations that traveled alongside maps and logs. Navigators were both scientists and poets, their empirical observations entwined with imagination and reflection. Human curiosity had transformed the sea from a boundary into a canvas, a stage for intellect and creativity, where knowledge and courage performed in unison. Every journey tested the limits of endurance and intellect. Storms tossed ships like toys, demanding constant recalculation and adaptation. Celestial navigation required patience and precision. One miscalculation of the sun's altitude could lead a ship hundreds of miles off course. In these trials, sailors learned resilience, ingenuity, and humility. Each successful crossing reinforced the importance of empirical knowledge. The stars were no longer merely symbols, they were instruments. The ocean, a laboratory where every experience became data, every challenge a lesson. Generations of explorers, from the unassuming fishermen of the Mediterranean to the ambitious captains of the Atlantic, contributed to a chain of knowledge that spanned centuries, forming the foundation of modern navigation. Even as technology advanced, the essence of exploration remained unchanged. While instruments improved and maps became more accurate, the ocean demanded respect. Mastery of the sea was not merely about tools. It was about understanding patterns, anticipating dangers, and maintaining the courage to continue despite uncertainty. Mariners developed not only skills, but a profound intuition, a sensitivity to the natural world born from countless hours at sea. This knowledge was cumulative, layered, and complex, blending observation, calculation, and experience into a coherent understanding that was as much art as science. Even as centuries passed, the spirit of those first daring navigators never faded. Their discoveries, recorded meticulously in logbooks and journals, became treasures of knowledge passed down to the next generation of explorers. Children of the sea grew up hearing tales of winds that could carry a ship across an ocean in days, and currents that could betray the untrained sailor. They learned that maps were more than ink and parchment, they were living guides, capable of saving lives and shaping destinies. Every coastline charted, every reef avoided, every hidden cove discovered was a triumph not only of courage but of accumulated wisdom, a testament to the ingenuity of minds willing to question, observe, and adapt. In the bustling ports of Lisbon, Seville, and Venice, the lessons of centuries were distilled into manuals, shared among captains and navigators. Knowledge of celestial navigation, seamanship, and meteorology was no longer confined to oral tradition. It became codified, structured, and taught systematically. Schools of navigation emerged, institutions where theory met practice, and young mariners learned to interpret the wind, the waves, and the stars. These centers became crucibles for innovation, incubators for techniques that would guide fleets across oceans previously considered impassable. The age of exploration was not an accident of bravery alone, it was the result of careful observation, experimentation, and methodical refinement. The evolution of ship design continued apace. Hulls were reinforced to withstand far more violent storms. masts and rigging optimized to capture wind from every possible angle, and rudders refined for unprecedented control. Innovations were iterative, born of trial, error, and relentless attention to detail. Sailors recorded each miscalculation, every failed voyage, using those lessons to prevent future catastrophe. They learned that maps were more than ink and parchment, they were living guides, capable of saving lives and shaping destinies. Every coastline charted, every reef avoided, every hidden cove discovered was a triumph not only of courage but of accumulated wisdom, a testament to the ingenuity of minds willing to question, observe, and adapt. As the world shrank, empires rose and fell upon the mastery of the seas. Knowledge became power, and power demanded knowledge. Nations that invested in shipbuilding, navigation, and oceanography found themselves controlling trade routes, dictating terms, and projecting influence across the globe. Explorers, scientists, and cartographers became critical instruments of statecraft, their skills as decisive as any army. Maps guided fleets to distant ports, compasses ensured they arrived. Every charted course, every successful crossing, was a strategic advantage in a world where distance and ignorance once protected kingdoms from one another. Yet, amid the relentless march of technology and empire, the poetry of the ocean endured. The first light of dawn reflecting off the waves, the endless horizon, the stars mirrored in dark waters, all reminded sailors that exploration was as much a spiritual journey as it was a technological one. Observing the natural world required patience and reverence, and the insights gained from these observations transformed society as profoundly as any conquest. Knowledge became shared heritage, a bridge between cultures, a foundation for trade, diplomacy, and understanding. By the 18th century, the tools had grown sophisticated. Sextants, chronometers, improved compasses, and detailed maps allowed mariners to navigate with a precision unimaginable to their medieval predecessors. Yet, the principles remained unchanged. Wind, current, celestial observation, and human ingenuity still dictated success or failure. The lessons of the earliest navigators, careful observation, meticulous record-keeping, and an unwavering respect for the ocean, were embedded in the DNA of every voyage. The compass, the map, and the stars continued to speak the same language first interpreted by daring individuals centuries before. Modern exploration, from oceanographic research vessels to intercontinental trade fleets, traces its lineage directly back to these early pioneers. GPS and satellite navigation have replaced the compass and sextant, yet the spirit remains constant. Humans continue to push beyond the known, propelled by curiosity, courage, and the relentless desire to map the unknown. The same drive that sent small caravels across the Atlantic now fuels submarines exploring the abyss and spacecraft venturing beyond the limits of Earth. The legacy of the sea is thus eternal, a continuous chain of discovery connecting generations across centuries. And so, as the waves roll endlessly, their rhythm echoing the heartbeat of history, the ocean remains a teacher and a muse. The compass points, the maps unfold, and each voyage is a dialogue between humanity and the unknown. Those who venture forth are heirs to centuries of observation, calculation, and imagination, their courage made tangible by the tools and techniques perfected over generations. The sea has changed, technology has advanced, but the essence remains. The horizon calls, and humanity answers. If the story of oceans crossed by daring navigators, the genius of their tools, and the courage to explore the unknown has inspired you, like, share, and subscribe. Support the continuation of these tales of discovery, ingenuity, and human ambition, so that the spirit of the explorers who first dared the horizon lives on in every new generation. The compass, the map, and the dream beyond the horizon endure. The oceans of discovery are infinite, and the journey never truly ends. As the sun dips below the horizon, casting golden light across endless waves, we pause to reflect on the journey we have taken together. From the timid first steps of early sailors, clutching crude compasses and staring nervously into the vast unknown, to the great caravels of Portugal and Spain slicing through the Atlantic, the story of human exploration is one of courage, ingenuity, and unyielding curiosity. Every voyage told in this series has been more than a passage across water. It has been a voyage of the mind, a testament to humanity's capacity to dream, to imagine, and to make the impossible tangible. The oceans have always been mirrors of our ambitions. Their waves whisper of the trials endured by those who dared to challenge the unknown. The winds carry the echoes of those first navigators, whose courage and meticulous observation transformed fear into mastery. It was not luck that allowed ships to reach distant shores. It was knowledge, the knowledge of currents, stars, winds, and tides, coupled with the human spirit's unrelenting will to push boundaries. Every compass needle aligned, every map carefully drawn, every calculation of latitude and longitude was a conversation between humans and the vast, indifferent sea. Think of the countless hours spent under starlit skies, sextants in hand, calculating the ship's position, the crew's fate balanced precariously on each judgment. Imagine the strain of storms that threatened to rend sails and split timbers. Yet the mariners pressed onward, guided by the steady rotation of the celestial sphere and the quiet, reassuring point of the compass. It is this combination of science and courage, of understanding and intuition, that has allowed humanity to transform the unknown into the known, to shrink the oceans with every voyage, and to lay the foundation of a global civilization. We must also remember the countless unseen hands behind these journeys, the cartographers who labored over intricate portolan charts, translating the chaotic, endless ocean into precise lines and curves, the shipwrights who shaped wood with unmatched skill to withstand the power of storms, the instrument makers whose delicate craftsmanship ensured the accuracy of compasses, astrolabes, and chronometers. These artisans, scientists, and engineers were the unsung heroes of exploration. Their meticulous work, often underappreciated in their time, allowed bold captains to navigate safely across hundreds of leagues of unknown water, connecting continents and civilizations in ways that would have seemed magical to their predecessors. Yet, exploration has never been without consequence. Every discovery reshaped the world, bringing knowledge, but also conflict, trade and conquest, connection and disruption. The same compass that guided merchants to new markets led armies across oceans. The same maps that revealed fertile lands charted the paths of empires. To honor this history is to acknowledge both the wonder and the responsibility inherent in discovery. It is to appreciate that every voyage, every calculation, every innovation carries with it the potential to change the course of human destiny. And so, as we conclude this series, we invite you to carry forward the spirit of those who first dared to cross the unknown. Like the explorers of old, you too can be a navigator of ideas, of curiosity, and of knowledge. By engaging, sharing, and supporting this journey, you participate in the continuum of exploration, ensuring that stories of courage, science, and human ingenuity are not confined to the past, but continue to inspire new generations. When you hit like, you honor the audacity of those who first set sail into uncertainty. When you share, you spread the lessons learned from centuries of trial, error, and discovery. And when you subscribe, you become part of a community committed to curiosity, learning, and the celebration of human achievement. The ocean is vast, yet within it lies the story of every human who has ever looked beyond the horizon and asked, "What lies there?" The compass may have guided their hands, but it was the heart and mind that guided their choices. The map may have charted their course, but it was their courage that ensured they would arrive. And in following these stories, we discover not only the paths of the past, but the guiding principles for the future: observation, diligence, imagination, and the relentless desire to explore. Every wave that laps against the hull of a ship is a reminder of the continuity of this journey. Every star in the night sky recalls the celestial markers that have guided explorers for centuries. Every gust of wind in the sails reminds us that, despite technological progress, the fundamental challenges of the sea, its power, unpredictability, and vastness remain unchanged. By engaging with these stories, by immersing yourself in the struggles, triumphs, and discoveries of the past, you keep alive the knowledge and inspiration that drive innovation, curiosity, and human achievement. So take a moment to reflect on the immense courage, the precise calculation, and the tireless effort that carried humanity across oceans and into new worlds. Consider the lessons of history, the tools developed to master the unknown, and the vision required to transform dreams into reality. And as you do, join us in celebrating this incredible legacy. Support this journey by liking, sharing, and subscribing. Encourage others to witness the remarkable story of human exploration, to understand how a simple needle, a sheet of parchment, and the courage to venture beyond the horizon have shaped the world we know today. The oceans remain vast, the horizon still calls, and the dream of discovery is eternal. With each like, share, and subscription, you honor the explorers of the past and inspire those who will chart new courses tomorrow. Stay curious, keep exploring. The seas of knowledge are endless, and together we can continue to navigate them, one story at a time. The compass still points, the maps still unfold, the horizon still awaits, and the journey, as it always has, goes on.